Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The floorboards in the hallway outside my bedroom creak at 3:17 a.m. Every night, same time, same rhythm, 3 distinct groans like footsteps approaching my door, then stopping. Just stopping. I've lived in this house for 4 months now, ever since the rotating circuit of relatives' couches and spare rooms finally wore thin. Everyone has their limits, even family pretending they don't. The rent here is suspiciously low, but I told myself that's just how it is in this forgotten corner of town where the streetlights flicker more than they shine and neighbors keep their curtains drawn even in daylight. The house came furnished. That should have been my first warning. Who leaves behind a perfectly good bed, a kitchen table, dishes in the cabinets? But I needed walls of my own, a door with a lock, silence that belonged to me. I got the walls. I got the door. The silence, though, that was never mine. The first week passed normally enough. I unpacked the few boxes I owned, arranged my books on the built-in shelves, tried to ignore how the living room felt colder than the rest of the house even when the heat was on. The previous tenant had left behind a collection of things. A cracked mirror in the bathroom, a coat still hanging in the hall closet, a half-empty bottle of aspirin in the medicine cabinet. Small abandonments that suggested departure rather than departure planned. On the 8th night, I woke to find someone standing at the foot of my bed. Not someone. Something. The shape of someone. The darkness there was denser, more deliberate than the shadows cast by my dresser or the curtains. It didn't move when I jerked upright. Didn't react when I fumbled for the lamp switch. Light flooded the room and there was nothing. Just my furniture, my clothes draped over the chair, my racing heart. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I told myself it was a dream, that half-awake state where the mind conjures fears from nothing. But I'd felt awake. I'd felt the weight of being watched, the specific pressure of eyes on skin that makes you check over your shoulder in empty rooms. The banging started 3 nights later. It comes from inside the walls. Heavy, rhythmic, purposeful. 3 knocks. Always 3. Sometimes from the kitchen, the sound echoing through the pipes. Sometimes from the bedroom wall behind my headboard, shaking the frame. Sometimes from underneath the floorboards, as if something down there in the crawl space is demanding to be let up. I've checked, of course. During daylight hours, when the house feels merely old rather than malevolent, I've searched for loose pipes, for settling foundations, for any rational explanation. The pipes are solid, the foundation is sound. The house has no reason to make these noises, yet every night it does. Then came the fever. It hit me suddenly, viciously on a Tuesday evening. One moment I was heating soup on the stove. The next I was shivering so hard I could barely stand. I made it to bed somehow, buried myself under every blanket I owned, and descended into dreams that felt more like drowning. In the fever haze I heard whispers, not the soft murmur of distant conversation, but violent hissing. Words spat with hatred in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood the intent of. Angry, hungry, demanding. They came from everywhere and nowhere, seeping through the walls like smoke. When I opened my eyes, or thought I opened them, impossible to tell in that state, my bedroom door was swinging open. Not the gentle drift of a poorly latched door catching a breeze, but a deliberate, slow arc, as if someone's hand were pushing it. The hallway beyond gaped black and absolute, darker than any natural shadow should be. I wanted to get up, to close it, but my body wouldn't respond. The fever had nailed me to the mattress, and all I could do was watch as shapes began to move in that darkness. 3 of them. They emerged from the hallway's throat like smoke given form, flowing rather than walking, their movements synchronized in a way that made my fever-addled brain think of dancing. But this wasn't any dance I knew. This was ancient, ritualistic, wrong. They swayed and circled, spinning around each other in patterns that hurt to follow, that made my eyes water and my head pound even harder. I tried to speak, to shout, to do anything, but the whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. The three shapes moved closer to my bed, and I could almost see faces in the darkness of their forms, or the suggestion of faces, features that appeared and disappeared like images in static. Then one of them reached toward me. I must have passed out, because the next thing I remember is waking to pale morning light. The bedroom door firmly closed, my sheets soaked with sweat. The fever had broken. I told myself it was a hallucination, nothing more than the brain's confusion under high temperature. But there were 3 spots on my bedroom floor, near the foot of the bed, where the wood was darker than the rest. Stains in a perfect triangle, each the size of a footprint. The stains were gone by evening. I checked after work, and the floor was uniform again, no marks at all. I almost felt relieved until I realized that made it worse. Either I'd imagined them, or something had cleaned them away. That night, the shadow person returned to the foot of my bed, and the night after, and every night since. I've stopped turning on the lights. There's no point. It's always there in those first moments of waking, always in the same place. That column of concentrated darkness that shouldn't exist in a room with ambient light from the street lamp outside. I've tried ignoring it, tried staring it down, tried speaking to it. It never responds. It just stands, watches, waits. The banging has gotten worse. 3 knocks, but now they're closer, more insistent. Last week, I woke to the sound coming from inside my bedroom closet. The night before that, from under my bed. I don't open the closet anymore. I don't look under the bed. I'm terrified of what I might see, or worse, what I won't see, because then I'll know for certain that I'm losing my mind. I've tried researching the house's history, but records are sparse. The clerk at the town hall looked at me strangely when I asked, said something about the property changing hands frequently over the years. Nothing unusual, just unlucky timing with the market. But I saw the way she glanced at the address on my form, the slight tightening around her eyes. She knew something. I found a book in the basement last month, tucked behind the water heater where no one had any reason to look. It was old, leather-bound, the pages brittle with age. The language was Arabic, I think, though I couldn't read it. But there were illustrations, diagrams of circles and symbols, drawings of figures that looked disturbingly like the shapes I'd seen during my fever. 3 of them, always 3, dancing in eternal configuration. On one page, someone had written a note in English, the handwriting shaky and urgent. They answer to 3s, 3 knocks to call, 3 shadows to serve, 3 nights of dreams to bind. Don't sleep, don't let them in, don't. The sentence ended there, unfinished, the pen's final mark dragging across the page as if the writer had been pulled away mid-word. I should have left then. Should have packed my things and found somewhere else, anywhere else. But where would I go? Back to relatives who'd already grown tired of my presence? To another cheap rental that might harbor its own darkness? At least here, I knew what I was dealing with. Sort of. The whisper dreams have become regular occurrences. I fall asleep, when I can sleep, and immediately I'm drowning in those violent hisses, those words in a language that bypasses my ears entirely and speaks directly to some older part of my brain. They're always angry, always demanding, but beneath the rage is something else. Hunger, a desperate, ancient hunger that's been waiting far too long to be fed. I wake from these dreams with the taste of copper in my mouth and marks on my arms. Not scratches exactly, but impressions, as if fingers had gripped me hard enough to bruise without breaking the skin. 3 marks on each arm, perfectly spaced, thumbprint and 2 fingers in a grip that suggests both restraint and possession. Last night something new happened. I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the familiar creak in the hallway, but this time I felt it. A presence not just in the room but inside my head, pushing against my thoughts like water against a dam. The shadow person at the foot of my bed had multiplied. There were 3 of them now, arranged in that same triangular pattern from my fever dream, and they were moving. Not toward me, around me. The same ritual dance, spinning and swaying in perfect synchronization. The air grew thick, hard to breathe, and a fog began to seep into the room from nowhere. It started white, then gray, then darker, cycling through shades of shadow until it was black as pitch, obscuring everything. I couldn't see the walls, couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. The only things visible were the three shapes, outlined in something that wasn't quite light but rather an absence of darkness, a negative space that defined their forms. They were closer now, close enough that I could hear them. Not the violent whispers of my dreams, but something worse. Breathing. Deep, hollow breaths that rattled like wind through empty houses, like the death rattle of lungs that had forgotten how to properly function. One of them extended what might have been a hand, might have been something else entirely. It reached toward my face and I felt cold, a cold so profound it burned, so complete it stopped being a sensation and became a state of being. My breath frosted in the air, my lips went numb. Then, impossibly, I heard my own voice. "Let me in," I said, except I hadn't opened my mouth. The words came from one of the shapes, spoken in my exact tone, my exact inflection. "Let me in, let me in, let me..." All three took up the chant. My voice multiplied and overlapping, creating a chorus of myself, begging for entry into my own body. The black fog pulsed with each word, growing thicker, pressing against my face like a suffocating blanket. I tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Instead, I felt something give way inside me, not physically, but deeper, in the place where the self lives. Like a door in my mind swinging open, like that bedroom door during the fever, something was crossing a threshold, and I couldn't tell if it was them coming in or me going out. The fog turned white again. The shapes dissolved. I was alone in my bedroom, dawn light creeping through the curtains, my alarm about to ring for work. But something was different. I got up, went through my morning routine, made coffee, brushed my teeth. Everything felt normal, exactly as it should. Yet underneath the normalcy ran a current of wrongness I couldn't define. It was like watching myself from a distance, piloting my body through familiar motions while something else observed from just behind my eyes. At work, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and froze. For just a moment, less than a heartbeat, I saw three faces looking back at me from my own features. The same face, repeated and overlapping, slightly out of sync, like a photograph printed multiple times on the same page. I blinked, and it was just me again. Just my face, tired and drawn but singular. My face. I think it's my face. Tonight I'm sitting in my living room as 3 a.m. approaches. The house is quiet, but it's the wrong kind of quiet. Expectant. Waiting. The shadows in the corners seem darker than they should be, more substantial. I keep catching movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turn to look directly, there's nothing there. Or rather, there's nothing there yet. In 17 minutes, the floorboards will creak. 3 times. Something will approach my door, and I don't know if I'll be on this side of it or the other when it opens. The worst part isn't the fear anymore. It's the curiosity. Part of me, and I can't tell if it's the part that was always me or the part that's been added, wants to know what happens if I let them finish what they started. If I stop fighting. If I acknowledge that maybe, in some fundamental way, I'm already not entirely myself anymore. The clock reads 3:15 a.m. I can hear breathing that isn't mine. The fog is starting to form at the edges of the room, wisps of white that will soon darken. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in a voice that sounds exactly like mine but comes from somewhere else entirely, I hear, "Just 2 more nights, then we'll be complete." But I've lost count of how many nights have passed since this began. Time here doesn't move the way it should. Has it been 4 months? Or has it been longer? Have I been here my whole life, dreaming of a time before the house, before the shadows, before the threes? I look down at my hands, and for a moment, they seem to flicker. Solid, then translucent, then solid again. Like I'm the shadow, and something else is becoming real. The clock now reads 3:17 a.m. The first creak echoes down the hallway. I close my eyes, but I can still see the shapes forming, feel them moving closer, know with absolute certainty that when I open my eyes again, there will be 3 of me sitting in this chair. and none of us will remember which one was original. If there ever was an original. If I was ever real at all. The breathing grows louder, harmonizing with my own, until I can't tell where mine ends and theirs begins. The second creak sounds, closer now, and I find myself standing up, walking toward the hallway, toward the darkness waiting there, not with fear, but with the strange, terrible relief of coming home to a place I've always belonged. The third creak echoes through the house. The door is opening, and we welcome ourselves inside. Story 2. The pencils formed a perfect cross on the lined paper, balanced so delicately that a breath could topple them. My roommate held his thumb on one side, I pressed mine opposite, and we whispered the question 3 times into the stale basement air. The game seemed stupid, childish even. But we'd been drinking, and boredom does strange things to judgment at 2 a.m. When nothing happened after the third repetition, he laughed and suggested we make it real. Before I could process what he meant, he'd pulled a pocket knife from his jeans and dragged it across his thumb. 3 dark drops fell onto the paper, spreading into the fibers like roots seeking soil. He handed me the knife, his eyes challenging in the dim fluorescent light. I should have refused. Should have laughed it off, cleaned up the mess, gone to bed. Instead, I mimicked his action, watching my own blood pool beside his on the page. The red mixing until I couldn't tell whose was whose. We pressed our thumbs together over the pencils, and I felt the warm wetness between us as we asked the question one final time. Charlie, will we be rich? The pencils didn't move. Not immediately. We waited, the only sound our breathing and the furnace kicking on in the corner. Then, slowly, so slowly I thought it was the vibration from the furnace, the pencils began to rotate. They spun clockwise, gathering speed, until they clattered off the paper and skittered across the concrete floor. We'd both jerked back, laughing nervously, blaming the furnace, the uneven floor, anything but what we'd just attempted. My roommate scooped up the paper, the blood now dried to a rust-brown stain, and tossed it in the trash. We climbed the stairs, double-checking the basement door was locked behind us, and tried to pretend the tightness in our chests was just the alcohol. That was 6 days ago. The handprints appeared on the 3rd morning. I found them while carrying laundry down to the basement, smeared across the white-painted wall near the bottom of the stairs. 4 fingers on each hand, pressed into the paint as if someone had leaned there, waiting. My first thought was my roommate, some kind of prank to spook me after our late-night ritual. But the fingers were too small, like a child's, and they were clustered in places too high for anyone of that size to reach comfortably. Besides, he'd been at his girlfriend's place overnight. I tried washing them off, scrubbing with every cleaner under the sink until my knuckles ached, and the chemical smell made my eyes water. The prints smeared, turned the white paint gray, but the impressions themselves seemed permanently etched into the surface, as if the pressure had gone through the paint and into the drywall beneath. Eventually, I gave up and avoided that section of the stairs, taking the outside route to the basement door when I needed something from storage. My roommate noticed them that evening. I heard him on the stairs, his footsteps stopping, then the sound of him touching the wall, his palm making contact with the paint. When he came up, his face had gone pale, and he asked if I'd done it. I told him no. He nodded slowly, then asked if I'd looked at them closely. Really looked. I hadn't wanted to, but I went down with him. He pointed to the lowest set of prints, the ones at shin height that I'd initially overlooked. The fingers there weren't just pressed against the wall, they seemed to be clawing, the tips of each impression deeper than the base, as if whatever made them had been trying to climb, or pull itself up from somewhere lower. Neither of us mentioned the game. We didn't need to. The thought hung between us like smoke, visible but intangible, something we could see but couldn't quite grasp. The basement noise started that same night. At first, I thought the neighbors were having a party. Bass-heavy music thudding through the walls, the low murmur of voices, occasional bursts of laughter, but the sound wasn't coming from next door. It rose from below, muffled by the floor, but undeniably present. I checked the time. 2:47 a.m. I crept to the basement door and pressed my ear against the wood. The sounds were clearer here, not quite music but rhythmic, like footsteps on the concrete floor, multiple people moving in sync, furniture scraping, glass clinking, the cadence of a gathering in full swing. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, and found it locked. I'd locked it myself before bed. I was certain of it. The key hung on its hook by the door, untouched. When I finally worked up the courage to unlock it and flip on the light, the sound stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than any noise, pressing against my eardrums until they ached. I descended 3 steps, enough to see most of the basement, and found it exactly as we'd left it. Washing machine quiet in the corner, storage boxes stacked neatly, furnace humming its normal mechanical rhythm. But the air felt different, warmer than it should be, and carrying a smell I couldn't quite place. Something between burnt sugar and stale sweat, the lingering scent of bodies in a closed space. My roommate came up behind me, drawn by the light, and I asked him if he'd heard it. He had, he said, but he'd assumed I was watching something loud on my phone. We stood there together, staring into the basement's fluorescent glare, neither of us willing to admit what we were thinking. Eventually, he suggested we were both on edge, stressed from work, our minds playing tricks. I wanted to believe him. The next night, the party sounds returned. Same time, same insistent rhythm. This time, I didn't check. I buried my head under my pillow and tried to convince myself it was pipes, the house settling, anything but what it felt like. In the morning, I found new handprints, these ones on the inside of the basement door, as if something had been trying to get out. 4 fingers, pressed into the wood with enough force to leave indentations. The lights began their dance on the 5th day. Not all at once, but in sequence, as if something was moving through the house, flipping switches as it passed. Kitchen to living room to hallway to bedroom. Sometimes they'd flicker instead, rapid pulses that made shadows jump and stretch. I changed bulbs, checked the breaker box, called an electrician who found nothing wrong with the wiring and suggested it might be a problem with the grid. But the utility company reported no outages, no fluctuations, nothing that would explain the behavior. Doors followed. They'd swing open slowly when I'd close them, or slam shut when I'd left them ajar. Never while I was watching, only in my peripheral vision, or when I'd turned away. I started testing myself, convinced I was misremembering their positions, gaslighting myself with my own paranoia. I'd photograph a closed door, leave the room, return to find it open, check the photo to confirm I hadn't imagined the initial state. The photos never lied. The doors did. My roommate grew distant, speaking in clipped sentences, avoiding eye contact. He spent more time at his girlfriend's place, and when he was home, he stayed in his room with the door not just closed but barricaded. I could hear him pushing furniture against it each night. Once, I asked him directly if he thought something was wrong, if maybe we'd actually done something that night in the basement. He told me to stop, his voice sharp enough to cut. Then, quieter, he added that he'd been having dreams where something with 2 small hands pressed against his bedroom window, asking to be let in, promising wealth beyond measure if he'd only open the latch. I'd been having similar dreams, but in mine, the thing at the window had my face. The scratches appeared on my forearms first, thin red lines that looked like I'd pushed through blackberry bushes. I hadn't been anywhere near thorns, hadn't felt anything that might cause them, but there they were. 3 parallel marks, each spaced as if drawn by fingers. By the next morning, there were more on my shoulders, across my back, down my calves. My roommate had them too, though he refused to show me, only acknowledging them when I mentioned mine. We stopped going into the basement entirely. Laundry piled up, storage items went unretrieved, and we both pretended not to notice the sounds that continued nightly. But avoidance didn't help. The handprints began appearing on the main floor, on bathroom mirrors, bedroom walls, the refrigerator door. Always 4 fingers, always too small, always in places that suggested watching, waiting. His girlfriend visited on the 6th day, her first time at the apartment in nearly a week. She lasted 20 minutes before she left, pale and shaking, refusing to explain what she'd seen or felt, but making him promise to find another place to stay. He packed a bag that evening, his movements jerky and rushed, and told me I should leave too. That we'd messed with something we shouldn't have. That the game wasn't just a game. That blood made it binding. I asked him what we'd bound ourselves to. He said he didn't know, but he'd researched the ritual, if you could call our drunken stupidity that, and found variations of it across cultures. All warnings against sealing spirit contracts with blood. Most promised that entities summoned this way would grant wishes but extract payments far exceeding the gifts. And all of them mentioned a specific sign, handprints with only 4 fingers, left by things that weren't quite human, that existed in spaces between what is and what isn't. After he left, the apartment felt larger, the silence more profound. I considered following his advice, packing up and disappearing, letting the lease lapse and the security deposit evaporate. But something kept me rooted. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness, or the creeping certainty that leaving wouldn't help. That whatever we'd invited in that night wasn't tied to the location but to us, to the blood we'd mixed and the question we'd asked. The party in the basement grew louder each night, no longer confined to the early morning hours. It would start around midnight and continue until dawn, the sounds varying, sometimes music and laughter, sometimes crying, sometimes just footsteps, endless footsteps pacing the concrete floor. I stopped trying to investigate. I knew what I'd find. An empty basement, stale air, and the certainty that something was very wrong. On the 7th night, I woke to silence. Complete, suffocating silence. No furnace hum, no traffic noise from the street, no ambient sound at all. The quality of quiet that makes your ears ring, searching desperately for any input. I lay in bed, covers pulled to my chin like a child, and realized the basement door was open. I hadn't opened it. I was certain. But pale light spilled up the stairs, flickering like candles, and I could hear something rising from below. Not footsteps, not music, just a presence, heavy and expectant, climbing toward the main floor with the patience of something that had been waiting far longer than 7 days. The handprints on my bedroom door were fresh, I realized, still wet. And they weren't just 4-fingered anymore. The one nearest the knob had 5, the thumb smudged and awkward, as if whatever made it was learning, adapting, getting closer to what it needed to be. I heard my own voice then, drifting up from the basement, asking the question again and again, Charlie, Charlie, will we be rich? Charlie, Charlie, will we be rich? But I was here, in bed, my lips pressed shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice continued, patient and persistent, asking the same question I'd asked, using the same inflection, the same rhythm. The light from the basement grew brighter, and I could see shadows moving on my bedroom ceiling, cast by nothing I could identify. 4-fingered shadows reaching and grasping, multiplying until they covered every surface. My phone buzzed. A text from my roommate. I can hear the party from here. 3 miles away, I can hear it. Another buzz. It followed me. Another. What did we lose? I noticed the typo. Loose instead of lose. And something about it made my stomach clench. Not a typo. A different word entirely. We hadn't lost anything. We'd loosed it. Set it free. Given it access through blood and invitation, opened a door we couldn't close. The voice from the basement was in the hallway now, still asking the question, still using my voice. I wondered if my roommate's voice was doing the same at his girlfriend's place, if we'd both become echo chambers for whatever had answered that night. If richness wasn't measured in money, but in the multiplication of presence, the wealth of existing in more than one place, more than one form. The scratches on my arms began to itch. When I looked down, they were moving, the red lines rearranging themselves into patterns, not random. Letters, words forming in my own skin, written by something beneath it. You asked, we answered, payment due. My bedroom door swung open, slow and deliberate. The hallway beyond was dark, but I could see the handprints there, dozens of them now, lining the walls like a timeline of approach. The ones nearest were larger, the fingers longer, more proportional to an adult hand, the learning curve progressing with each print. And at the end of the hallway, in the doorway leading to the stairs, stood a figure. Too dark to make out clearly, but small, hunched, with arms that seemed to bend wrong. It raised one hand. I could see 4 fingers silhouetted against the dim light from the street, and then it raised another, and another, and another. Not multiple figures. One figure with multiple arms, each hand pressing against the walls, the ceiling, the floor, leaving its signature with each contact. The voice was coming from it now, still mine but layered, overlapping, as if a dozen of me were speaking in unison. Charlie, Charlie, will we be rich? And beneath that question, barely audible but undeniably present, an answer in a voice that belonged to nothing human. You will be. Everyone will be. We'll make you rich with company. Never alone again. Never singular. Always us. Always together. Always full. The figure took a step into my room. Then another. Each movement left more prints, more marks of 4 fingers becoming 5, of something learning to be what it needed to be to collect what it was owed. I reached for my phone to call someone, police, family, anyone, but my own number was calling me now, the screen showing my contact photo, my name. I answered without thinking, and my voice filled the speaker. Charlie, Charlie, will we be rich? I hung up. It called again immediately. Again. Again. Each time the same question, my voice asking it, an infinite loop of inquiry that I'd started and couldn't stop. The figure stood at the foot of my bed now, close enough to touch, close enough to see that it wasn't quite solid, that it flickered like the lights, that it existed and didn't exist simultaneously. It extended a hand toward me, 5 fingers now, perfectly formed, reaching out as if to shake and seal the bargain we'd made. In the basement, the party reached its crescendo, the sound of celebration mixing with my endlessly repeated question, and I understood with crystalline clarity that richness had never been about money. It was about filling empty spaces, about never being alone, about the multiplication of presence until you couldn't tell where you ended and something else began. The hand touched my forehead, fingers cold and somehow wrong, and I felt myself starting to split. Not physically, not in any way I could describe, but I could sense another me forming somewhere else, asking the same question, carrying the same scratches, opening the same doors, and another, each of us rich with company, wealthy with presence, never singular again. My roommate's final text arrived as my vision split into double, then triple, then beyond counting. I can see you in my mirror. You're standing behind me, but you're not you. Are you still there? Are either of us still there? I tried to respond, but all my fingers could type was the question. The only question. The one we'd asked with blood and invitation. The one that would echo through every version of us that the thing at the foot of my bed was creating. Outside my window, I could see handprints appearing on the glass. 4 fingers, then 5, then 6. Learning. Always learning. Getting closer to what it needed. And somewhere in the basement, the party continued, filled with guests who all had my face, all asking the same question, all receiving the same answer, all paying the same price for a richness we'd never wanted and could never escape. The pencils had spun clockwise. I remember that now. We'd never asked them to stop. Story 3. The clock reads 4:29 a.m. when I wake, though I haven't set an alarm in years. My body knows. It always knows. I lie in the darkness of my apartment, covers pulled to my chin despite the summer heat, and I wait. The red digits flip to 4:30, and right on schedule I hear them. The footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Steady, measured, neither hurried nor hesitant. They pass by my apartment, continue down the corridor, and fade into the building's hollow silence. I should be used to this by now. I'm 32 years old, and these footsteps have been my faithful companion for nearly 3 decades. But familiarity breeds no comfort here, only a deeper, more intimate kind of dread. I don't go back to sleep. I never do after 4:30. My mother told me about the Ouija board when I was 25, drunk on wine at Thanksgiving. Her words slurred, but her eyes sharp with something that looked like guilt. She and my father had been young then, stupid and curious in that way people are when they think the world operates on logic alone. They'd invited friends over one October night, lit candles around the coffee table, and placed their fingers on the planchette like it was all just a game. She said they'd ask the usual questions. Is anyone there? What's your name? What do you want? The planchette moved. She insisted they weren't pushing it, though Dad had always maintained otherwise, and spelled out broken, nonsensical phrases. Most of it was gibberish. But then someone, probably her friend who'd brought the board, asked a different question. When will I have children? The planchette circled the board 3 times before settling on letters. N-O-T-Y-O-U. Then it moved again, faster, jerking beneath their fingers until it pointed directly at my mother. S-O-O-N. 3 months later, she was pregnant with me. The board had been thrown away that same night, burned in the fireplace until nothing remained but melted plastic and ash. But Mom said the smell lingered in that house for weeks, not burning plastic, but something organic and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. They moved before I was born. A fresh start, they'd said, somewhere clean. But some things I've learned don't care about fresh starts. The night terrors began when I was 4 years old. I would wake screaming, my small body rigid with fear I couldn't articulate. My parents would rush in to find me staring at the corner of the room, pointing at something they couldn't see. When I was finally calm enough to speak, I described the same thing every time. A figure standing in the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, with eyes that glowed red like hot coals in a dying fire. It never moved. It just watched. Sometimes, when I was particularly hysterical, I'd tell them about the other one, the blue woman. She was different from the red-eyed figure. Where he stood in patient stillness, she would crouch at the foot of my bed, her face pressed close to the covers, and laugh. Not a normal laugh. Something broken and wet, like she was drowning and delighted by it. Her skin wasn't blue like paint or clothing. It was the blue of oxygen-starved lips, of corpses in cold water. A child psychologist attributed it to an overactive imagination. Night lights were installed. My door was left open. My parents took turns sleeping on the floor of my room. But the terrors persisted through age 5, 6, 7. Eventually, mercifully, they faded. Or rather, I stopped screaming about them. Stopped pointing. Stopped trying to make my parents see what I saw. Because by then, I understood that some things are visible only to certain eyes. The footsteps started when I was 8. At first, I thought it was my father getting up for work, but his alarm didn't go off until 6. Then I thought it was a neighbor in our apartment building, someone with an early shift or insomnia. But the footsteps were too close, too precise. They moved through our apartment like someone familiar with the layout, down the hallway, past my room, into the kitchen. Sometimes I'd hear cabinets opening, the soft click of the refrigerator door, the creak of the floorboard by the bathroom. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate one morning, I found my father asleep on the couch, my mother still in their bedroom, both undisturbed. The kitchen was exactly as we'd left it the night before. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been taken. But I'd heard it, clear as my own heartbeat, clear as the fear rising in my throat. I stopped investigating after that, learned to lie still in bed, eyes fixed on my ceiling, counting the minutes until my parents' real alarms went off, and normal sounds filled the apartment. The footsteps came every morning at precisely 4:30 a.m. for years, through middle school, through high school, even when we moved to a different state when I was 14. New house, same footsteps, different floorboards, same creaking pattern. My father said old houses settle. My mother said I was having auditory hallucinations, a kind of waking dream. I said nothing. I'd learned by then that some arguments aren't worth having. I was 17 the night it spoke to me. I'd been lying awake as usual, waiting for 4:30. But that night felt different. The air in my room was thick, heavy, like invisible water pressing down on my chest. The digital clock seemed to move slower than it should, each minute stretching into something elastic and wrong. When 4:30 finally arrived, I heard them, the footsteps, faithful as always. But they didn't pass by my room. They stopped directly outside my door. The silence that followed was profound, absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant highway traffic, the settling of old wood, all of it ceased. I existed in a pocket of perfect quiet, and in that quiet, I realized I was holding my breath. Then I saw it. A shadow slid beneath my door, impossibly tall, impossibly thin. It rose up along my wall like smoke, stretching toward the ceiling until it took shape. A silhouette of something that might have been human once, or perhaps had never been human at all. 7 feet tall, at least, maybe more. Its proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long, head too narrow. And it leaned down, that impossible figure, until I felt breath on my face. Cold breath, smelling of earth and copper. A whisper, barely audible, brushed against my ear. I found you. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember my parents bursting in, finding me pressed against the wall, hyperventilating. I don't remember the trip to the emergency room or the psychiatric evaluation that followed. The next clear memory I have is sitting in a therapist's office 2 days later, being prescribed medication for anxiety and possible psychotic episodes. I took the pills. They helped, in a way. The terror became manageable, wrapped in chemical cotton. But the presence never left. I could still feel it, dulled but persistent, like a headache you learn to ignore. I moved out at 18, college across the country, then a job in another city, then another. I've never stayed anywhere longer than 2 years. People think I'm restless, ambitious, always chasing the next opportunity. They don't understand that I'm not moving towards something. I'm trying to move away. But it follows. I've seen it 4 times since that night when I was 17. Always at a distance, always watching. Once, through a crowd at a train station, a figure too tall, too still, while everyone else surged past in ordinary motion. Once, at the end of a hallway in my office building after everyone else had gone home, standing in the shadows by the emergency exit. Once, reflected in my apartment window when I lived on the 14th floor, somehow hovering in the empty air beyond the glass. And once, 6 months ago, on my roof. I'd gone up there to check on something. A noise I'd heard, some rational concern about raccoons or loose shingles. It was dusk, that uncertain hour when shadows grow long and the world softens into gray. I saw it crouched at the far edge of the roof, silhouetted against the dimming sky. The hands were wrong. That's what I noticed first. They weren't hands at all, but something else. Long, segmented things that curved into points. Claws. They gripped the edge of the roof with an ease that suggested weight and strength, though the figure itself seemed insubstantial, like it might dissipate in a strong wind. It turned its head toward me, slowly, deliberately, and I saw the eyes, still red, still glowing. After all these years, I left the roof. I left that apartment. I didn't pack. I drove to a hotel and stayed there for 3 days before I could bring myself to go back for my things. Even then, I hired movers. I never set foot on that roof again. The footsteps still come at 4:30 a.m. in my new apartment. I've stopped trying to escape them. You can't outrun your own shadow, and I've come to understand that's what this is. Not something external, but something tethered to me. Summoned before I was born by people who didn't know what they were doing, who thought reality was solid and immutable. My mother's guilt was real. I see that now. She knew on some level that they'd opened something that night, called out into the dark and received an answer they couldn't understand. The Ouija board had said soon, and 3 months later, I existed. But the board had been talking to something else first, making some kind of arrangement, some kind of deal. I am 32 years old, and I have never been alone. Not when I sleep, not when I wake, not in the spaces between. The figure with red eyes has been patient. It waited through my childhood, watching from corners. It waited through my adolescence, its presence growing stronger. It waited through my 20s as I ran from city to city, pretending I could escape. But it said it found me when I was 17, and I'm beginning to understand what that means. It wasn't looking for me then. It had always known where I was. The finding was something else, something deeper. It was the moment I finally saw it clearly, acknowledged its reality, stopped dismissing it as nightmare or hallucination. The moment I let it in. It's 4:28 a.m. now as I write this. 2 minutes until the footsteps. I'm sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, trying to make sense of 3 decades of patient haunting, trying to understand what it wants from me. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it doesn't want anything. Maybe it already has what it came for. The clock flips to 4:29. My heart rate increases right on schedule. Pavlovian dread. I can feel the air in the apartment growing thicker, heavier. The shadows in the hallway outside my kitchen seem darker than they should be. 1 minute. I think about my mother and her Ouija board, about doors opened that can never be closed, about the price of curiosity, about the things that wait in the spaces between questions and answers. 4:30. The footsteps begin, but this time they're not in the hallway outside my apartment. They're inside, moving through my living room, coming closer, steady, measured, neither hurried nor hesitant. And I realize, with a clarity that borders on relief, that I've been asking the wrong question all along. It's not what does it want, it's when will it be satisfied. The footsteps stop just beyond my kitchen doorway. I can't see anything there. The hallway is empty, shadowed but empty, yet I know it's standing there. I've always known. The same way I know my own heartbeat, my own breathing. I don't turn around to look. I don't need to, because after 32 years I finally understand the truth. The finding wasn't when I saw it at 17. The finding was what happened before I was born, when something answered the call on that Ouija board and marked me as its own. Everything since then has just been the long, patient wait for me to accept it. The air grows colder. I keep typing, because what else is there to do? The shadow stretches across my kitchen floor, impossibly long, impossibly thin, reaching toward my feet, and somewhere behind me, so close I can feel it like pressure against my skin, I hear that voice again. The same whisper from when I was 17, but clearer now, more certain. Welcome home. I close my laptop. The screen goes dark. In its reflection, I can see what's standing behind me, 7 feet tall with eyes like dying embers. But I don't scream. I don't run. Because after 32 years of being found, I'm too tired to keep pretending I was ever really lost. The question I'm left with isn't whether any of this is real, it's whether it matters. Whether the haunting exists in the world or only in my mind, it has shaped every day of my life, every decision, every moment of fear and flight. It has been more constant than any relationship, more faithful than any friend, and as the cold settles around me like a familiar embrace, as the footsteps begin again, moving past me into the apartment's other rooms, resuming their eternal patrol, I have to wonder, if I went back on the medication, back to therapy, back to explaining and defending and trying to convince myself this isn't real, would the footsteps stop? Would the shadow disappear? Would I finally be free? Or would I just stop seeing what's been there all along? The clock reads 4:31 a.m., 29 more years perhaps, until whatever began before my birth reaches its conclusion. Or maybe tomorrow. Maybe it's always been building towards something specific, some final moment of understanding or surrender. I get up from the table. My legs are steady. My hands don't shake. I walk past the shadow in the hallway, or through it, or around it, I can't quite tell anymore, and return to my bedroom. The sheets are cold, but I slide beneath them anyway. I close my eyes. At 4:32 a.m., or 32, the footsteps are still moving through my apartment. At 4:35, I hear a cabinet open in the kitchen. At 4:38, the soft creak of my bedroom door as it opens wider, though I'd left it half closed. I don't look. I never look anymore. Because I know what I'll see. Red eyes watching from the corner, patient and eternal. The same eyes that watched when I was 4, when I was 8, when I was 17. The same eyes that will watch tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and all the mornings that follow. I am 32 years old, and I have never been alone. And I'm beginning to suspect I never will be. The question isn't whether to accept this truth or fight it. The question is whether there was ever really a choice. Whether from the moment that Ouija board spelled out soon to my pregnant mother, my fate was sealed. Whether I've been living my life, or merely fulfilling a pattern set in motion before I drew my first breath. As I drift toward an uneasy sleep, I think about my mother's guilt. About how she never warned me, never told me the truth until I was 25 and already lost. I used to resent her for that silence. But now I wonder what she could have said that would have made any difference. You were promised to something before you were born. Something came looking, and you were the answer. I'm sorry, but you were never really mine. Would knowing have changed anything? Or would it have only added years of anticipatory dread to the inevitable reality? At 4:30 tomorrow morning, the footsteps will come again. They always do. And I will lie here in the darkness, wide awake, listening to something move through my space with the confidence of ownership. The only question left is the one I'm afraid to answer. Between the thing that follows me and the person I've become, which one of us is the guest here? And which one is truly home? Story 4. Well, the overhead bins rattled with a violence that suggested something fundamental had come loose in the aircraft's skeleton. I gripped the armrests, knuckles bloodless, as Flight 847 bucked through turbulence that felt less like weather and more like the plane itself was trying to shake us free. The cabin lights flickered, once, twice, and in that strobing darkness, I caught my reflection in the window, a man whose fear had carved itself into every line of his face. I'd avoided flying for 3 years. 3 years since Aunt Elizabeth's funeral. 3 years since I'd last trusted myself to anything I couldn't control. But my mother's surgery couldn't wait, and the drive from Denver to Boston would have taken too long. So here I was, strapped into seat 14C, breathing through my teeth as the Boeing 737 fought its way through a storm system that hadn't been in any forecast. The woman beside me, plump, middle-aged, smelling of lavender hand cream, had been trying to make conversation since takeoff. She'd given up 20 minutes ago when I'd faked sleep, but now she clutched my forearm with surprising strength. "Is this normal?" Her voice cracked on the second word. I wanted to reassure her. I wanted to say that yes, planes were built for this, that turbulence was just air currents, that we were perfectly safe. But the words dried up in my throat because the overhead panels were vibrating with a frequency that felt wrong, and somewhere toward the front of the cabin, someone was crying. The plane dropped. Not a gentle dip, but a stomach-lurching plummet that lasted 3, 4, 5 impossible seconds. Oxygen masks deployed with a chorus of plastic clicks, dangling before our faces like 100 yellow tongues. The lavender woman screamed. Others joined her. The sound built into something primal and collective, a choir of animal terror. I closed my eyes. That's when I felt her hand on mine. The touch was cool, impossibly gentle amid all that chaos. I knew without looking that it was Elizabeth, my aunt, my mother's sister, the woman who'd taught me to play chess and bake sourdough and face my fears with what she called practical courage, had been dead for 3 years. Cancer, swift and merciless. I'd held her hand in the hospice as she'd slipped away, had felt the moment life left her fingers. But this was her hand. I knew it the way you know your own heartbeat. "Open your eyes, sweetheart." Her voice cut through the screaming with crystalline clarity. as if we were sitting in her kitchen over coffee rather than plummeting through a thunderstorm at 30,000 feet. I obeyed. She sat in the middle seat that had been empty since takeoff, wearing the same cream-colored cardigan she'd favored in life. Her hair was silver, pinned back the way she always wore it. Her eyes, gray like winter clouds, held that familiar mix of warmth and no-nonsense pragmatism. She wasn't wearing shoes. Her feet were bare against the industrial carpet, toenails unpainted, the skin pale and waxy in the flickering cabin light. I stared at those feet because they were wrong, because even in the hospice, even on her worst days, Elizabeth had always worn her slippers. She'd been particular about that. Bare feet make me feel vulnerable, she'd once told me. Look at me, not my feet. Her tone was gently chiding, the way she'd sounded when I was 10 and couldn't focus on my homework. The plane shuddered again. The lavender woman had her face buried in her hands, sobbing. The overhead bins creaked, but Elizabeth sat perfectly still, solid and real, her hand steady over mine. Am I dying? The question came out as a whisper. She smiled, that slight, knowing curve of her lips that had always suggested she was one step ahead of whatever was troubling you. Not today, but you need to listen carefully. When the plane levels out, and it will, you're going to help the woman beside you with her oxygen mask. You're going to stay calm. You're going to remember that fear is just a feeling, not a fact. It was exactly the kind of thing Elizabeth would say. Practical courage. Then, she continued, her thumb tracing gentle circles on my wrist, you're going to visit me. You're dead. The words felt cruel to say, but I needed to anchor myself to something real. Visit my grave, she clarified, as if I'd simply misunderstood. 3 days from now, Saturday. Bring daisies. You know they're my favorite. And when you get there, look carefully. Really look. The turbulence was easing. I could feel it in my inner ear, in the way the plane's violent bucking was smoothing into mere bumps and shivers. The screaming had died down to scattered whimpers. The lavender woman still sobbed beside me, but softer now, as if she too could sense we'd passed through the worst of it. Why? I asked. Why would I? But Elizabeth was already fading. Not dramatically, not like mist or smoke in the movies. She simply became less present, less solid, the way a dream loses cohesion the moment you try to examine it too closely. Her hand lingered on mine for one more heartbeat. Cool, real, impossible. And then she was gone. The middle seat was empty again. Had always been empty. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady and professional, explaining that we'd encountered unexpected wind shear, but had cleared the worst of the system. We'd be landing in Boston roughly 30 minutes behind schedule. Flight attendants would be coming through the cabin shortly. He was sorry for the disturbance. I helped the lavender woman with her oxygen mask. My hands were shaking, but I managed. She thanked me between gasping breaths, her eyes red and swollen. Around us, people were laughing, that high, shaky laughter of those who'd brushed against something terrible and survived. A man in the row ahead was on his phone already, calling someone to say he was okay. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, collecting the masks, checking for injuries, projecting a calm that felt almost aggressive in its normalcy. I sat very still and stared at the empty middle seat. The rational part of my brain, the part I'd spent 3 years cultivating, the part that had helped me rebuild my life after Elizabeth's death, whispered that I'd hallucinated. Stress, fear. The brain did strange things under duress. I'd been thinking about Elizabeth because I was flying to see my mother, because the two sisters had always been linked in my mind. Terror had conjured her from memory and need. But I could still feel where her hand had rested on mine. The skin there was cool, tingling faintly, as if I'd touched ice. And those bare feet, those pale, vulnerable feet that Elizabeth would never have chosen to show. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of forced normalcy. We landed smoothly. I collected my carry-on, filed off the plane with the other passengers, made my way through Logan's crowded terminals. My mother was still in surgery when I reached the hospital. Everything was going well, the nurse assured me. So I sat in the waiting room with its stale coffee and worn magazines and tried not to think about what had happened at 30,000 feet. I lasted 2 days. On Saturday morning, I drove to Evergreen Cemetery. I'd been there 3 times since the funeral, once on the 6-month anniversary of her death, once on what would have been her 70th birthday, and once when I'd simply needed to feel close to her. Each visit had been difficult but manageable. Grief, I'd learned, became something you carried rather than something that carried you. This felt different. The cemetery was quiet, mist hanging low over the manicured grounds. Early spring bulbs pushed through the earth, crocuses, glory of the snow, early daffodils. I'd stopped at a florist and bought daisies, feeling foolish even as I did it. What was I doing? Following instructions from a hallucination? Letting fear drive me to seek meaning in trauma? But I couldn't shake the memory of her hand, the certainty of it. Elizabeth's grave sat beneath a young maple tree. The headstone, simple gray granite that read, Elizabeth Ann Brennan, 1954-2022. Beloved sister, aunt, friend. I laid the daisies against the base of the stone and stood there, hands in my pockets, feeling the morning chill seep through my jacket. I'm here, I said quietly. Just like you asked. I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking for. The cemetery didn't answer. A crow called from somewhere behind me. Wind rustled through the maple's bare branches. I circled the grave slowly, examining it from different angles. The grass was well maintained, the stone clean. Nothing seemed out of place. But Elizabeth had been specific. Look carefully. Really look. That's when I noticed the dirt at the base of the headstone was slightly disturbed. Not obviously, no one had been digging, but the earth there seemed fresher, darker, as if it had been recently turned or watered. I knelt, pressed my palm to the ground. The soil was damp but not wet, loose but not freshly disturbed. I was reaching for my phone, thinking vaguely about calling the cemetery office to report possible vandalism, when I saw the footprint. It was pressed into the soft earth beside the headstone, clear as a signature. A bare footprint, adult-sized. The impression of 5 toes, the curve of an arch, the heel pressed deep as if someone had stood there for a long time. My vision swam. I sat back hard on my heels, blood rushing in my ears. It could be anyone's footprint. Someone visiting another grave who'd taken off their shoes for some reason. A groundskeeper. A disturbed person who wandered cemeteries. Anything. Everything. But it was the right size. And it was positioned exactly where someone would have stood to look down at Elizabeth's grave from the foot end. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and took a photograph. The image was sharp, clear, undeniable. A bare footprint in the earth beside my dead aunt's grave. I called my cousin Timothy, Elizabeth's son, from the cemetery parking lot. We'd never been close. He was 15 years older than me, already middle-aged and distant when I was a kid. But he answered on the 3rd ring, sounding wary when I identified myself. I explained about the flight, about the hallucination, I was careful to call it that, and about the footprint. He was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. You need to know something, he finally said. His voice was rough, as if he'd been sleeping. About how we buried her. My hand tightened on the phone. Mom was very specific in her will. No embalming if possible. Natural burial practices. She had this whole thing about returning to the earth as naturally as possible. He paused, cleared his throat. And she wanted to be buried without shoes. Said she'd spent her whole life trapped in heels and loafers, and she wanted to go into the ground the way she'd come into the world, barefoot. The parking lot seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I leaned against my rental car, its cold metal the only solid thing in a world that had just lost all its edges. I never told anyone that, Timothy continued. It seemed too personal, too strange. At the viewing, we had her in shoes, the funeral home insisted. But in the casket before we closed it, he trailed off. No shoes. That's how she went into the ground. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed around words that had nowhere to go. Are you still there? Timothy asked. Yeah. It came out as a croak. Listen, I don't know what you saw on that plane. I don't know what it means. But my mother loved you. If there's any way she could have been there, if there's any... He stopped, seemed to gather himself. Just take care of yourself, okay? And maybe don't fly again for a while. After we hung up, I sat in the car for an hour, staring at the photograph on my phone. The bare footprint. Undeniable. Impossible. I've been home for 3 weeks now. My mother's surgery was successful. She's recovering well. I've been working from my apartment, avoiding crowds, jumping at unexpected sounds. I've scheduled an appointment with a therapist. The rational part of my brain insists there must be an explanation, must be something wrong with my perception or my processing of trauma. But every night I lie in bed and feel the ghost of Elizabeth's hand on mine. Cool, real, impossible. And I think about those bare feet pressed into the earth beside her grave, and I wonder, was she there? Did she somehow claw her way up through 6 feet of soil to leave that print? Or was she never truly buried at all? Or, and this is the thought that keeps me awake until dawn, is the boundary between the living and the dead thinner than I ever imagined, worn transparent in moments of extremity? And did my terror on that plane tear a hole large enough for her to reach through? I've booked another flight, not because I need to travel, but because I need to know. If I can make myself board that plane, if I can make myself sit in seat 14C again and wait for turbulence, will she come back? Will she tell me what I'm supposed to do with this impossible knowledge? Or will the middle seat stay empty? And will I finally have to accept that I'm losing the careful grip I've maintained on reality for 3 years? The flight leaves Tuesday morning. I've already checked in online, seat 14C. I've laid out clothes that won't show sweat stains. I've written a note to my mother, just in case. Nothing specific, just that I love her and I'm not afraid anymore. But that's a lie. I am afraid. More afraid than I've ever been, because I don't know what's worse. That my dead aunt reached across the boundary between worlds to comfort me in my moment of terror, or that my mind has cracked so completely that I've conjured evidence of the impossible and arranged it like scripture to make sense of my own unraveling. Either way, I'll know soon. Either way, I'm going to look. And if I see her again, if that middle seat fills with her solid, impossible presence, if she reaches for my hand with those cool fingers, I'm going to ask her to show me her feet. Because I need to know if the dead carry the dirt of their graves with them when they walk among the living, or if they return to us clean and barefoot and free of everything but their love. I need to know which kind of haunting this is. The daisies I left on her grave are probably dead by now, brown and withered in the spring cold. But when I close my eyes, I can still smell their clean, simple scent mixing with the airplane's recycled air. And I can still feel the cool pressure of her hand telling me to breathe, to stay calm, to remember that fear is just a feeling, not a fact. Not yet. But Tuesday is coming, and with it, seat 14C, and the empty space beside me that may or may not stay empty. And somewhere beneath 6 feet of earth, my Aunt Elizabeth lies barefoot in her cream-colored cardigan, either peaceful in death or restless enough to walk, and I'm the only one who seems to know the difference. Or maybe I'm the only one who's broken enough to need there to be one. I packed my carry-on this morning. I'm ready. As ready as anyone can be to deliberately step back into the moment when the world's rules stopped making sense. When I get to the airport, I'll pass through security, walk to the gate, present my boarding pass like I'm not carrying an impossible question in my chest that grows heavier with every breath. And when I sit down in 14C, I'll close my eyes. I'll wait for turbulence. I'll wait for her hand. And this time I won't look away from her feet. Story 5. The airport security officer held the ceramic face up to the fluorescent light, turning it slowly between his latex-gloved fingers. 400 years old, the merchant in Cusco had promised. Pre-Incan artifacts from a burial site high in the Andes. The face stared back at the officer with hollow eyes and a mouth frozen mid-scream, its terracotta surface pocked with age and earth stains. "Personal collection?" the officer asked. I nodded. trying to keep my voice steady despite the line of impatient travelers behind me. The three other faces waited in bubble wrap inside my carry-on, their presence somehow palpable, even through the protective layers. My wife had told me not to buy them. Standing in that cramped market stall with incense smoke curling through the air and the vendor's yellow teeth flashing in the dim light, I'd felt the pull of something I couldn't name. History, maybe. Or just the collector's greed that had always gotten me into trouble. The officer handed the vase back without further questions, and 6 hours later, I was arranging all four faces on the mantelpiece in our Brooklyn brownstone. My wife came home from her shift at the hospital to find me positioning them just so, adjusting the angle of each hollow-eyed stare. "They're watching us," she said, setting her bag down with a heavy thump. I laughed, but the sound came out wrong in the silence of our living room. The afternoon light slanted through the windows at a strange angle, catching the faces in a way that made their shadows stretch long and distorted across the wall. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw those shadows move independently, twisting like smoke. "They're just clay," I said. 4 centuries of clay and dirt. But even as I spoke, I felt it, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the animal awareness of being observed. I turned away from the mantelpiece and tried to shake the feeling, attributing it to jet lag and the 3 cups of airplane coffee still jangling through my system. The first incident happened that night. I woke to the sound of shattering glass, the crash echoing through the brownstone with a violence that sent my heart hammering against my ribs. My wife grabbed my arm in the darkness, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. We found the kitchen window shattered inward, glittering fragments scattered across the tile floor like fallen stars. The strange part was the lack of any projectile, any brick or stone that might have broken through. Just the window, exploded as if from some internal pressure. "Kids," my wife said, but her voice wavered. "Probably kids with a slingshot." We swept up the glass in silence, and I felt those ceramic faces watching us from the next room, their eyeless sockets somehow trained on our movements. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself a lot of things in those early days. The plumber came 3 days later, after we woke to find water seeping through the ceiling, dripping in a steady rhythm that sounded almost like whispered counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. The burst pipe had flooded the bathroom above, warping the floorboards and sending rusty water cascading down the walls. The plumber, a heavy-set man with grease under his fingernails, looked at the corroded pipe and shook his head. "These pipes are barely 10 years old," he muttered. "Shouldn't be corroded like this. Looks like they've been here for decades." After he left, I stood in the living room and studied the faces. Had I positioned them differently? The leftmost one seemed to have rotated slightly, its screaming mouth now angled toward the stairs. I reached out to adjust it, and the ceramic felt warm under my fingers. Warm in a way that had nothing to do with the autumn sun filtering through the windows. My wife's car broke down on the bridge the following Tuesday. The engine simply died, she told me over the phone, her voice tight with suppressed panic. No warning, no sputtering or coughing. Just silence, and the sudden understanding that she was stranded in rush hour traffic with no way to move. The mechanic found nothing wrong with the engine when they towed it to the shop. "Started up fine," he said. "Must have been a fluke." But I was beginning to understand that flukes had nothing to do with it. Work became impossible. I'd sit at my desk in the converted spare bedroom, trying to focus on the architectural plans spread before me, but my attention would drift toward the doorway, toward the living room where those faces waited. I could feel them through the walls, their presence a constant pressure at the edge of my awareness. Twice, I could have sworn I heard breathing from the mantelpiece, slow, raspy inhalations that made my skin crawl. Each time I investigated, I found nothing but those 4 faces, arranged exactly as I'd left them. Except they weren't, were they? The angles had changed, the positions had shifted. The rightmost face, with its elongated skull and hollow cheekbones, now pointed directly at our bedroom door. "You need to get rid of them," my wife said one morning, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. She'd been having nightmares, she told me. Dreams of drowning in dirt, of being buried alive while clay faces watched from above. their mouths opening and closing soundlessly. She'd wake up gasping, clawing at her throat, convinced that soil was filling her lungs. I promised I would. I promised a lot of things. But every time I approached the mantelpiece with the intention of packing them away, something stopped me. My hands would freeze mid-reach, muscles locked in place by a force I couldn't name. Or I'd find myself standing in front of them without any memory of walking to the living room, staring into those empty eye sockets while minutes or hours dissolved around me. Time became elastic in the brownstone, stretching and compressing in ways that left me disoriented and nauseous. The smell started in the 4th week. A dank, earthy odor that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, like the scent of freshly turned graves. My wife called an inspector, convinced we had mold behind the drywall. He found nothing. The smell persisted, growing stronger each day until I could taste it on my tongue. Loam and decay and something else, something ancient and patient. That night, I saw them move. I'd been sitting in the dark living room, unable to sleep, watching the streetlight outside paint yellow rectangles across the floor. The faces sat in shadow on the mantelpiece, barely visible. Then, so slowly I almost missed it, the leftmost face rotated. Not much, maybe 30 degrees, but enough that its screaming mouth now pointed directly at where I sat frozen in my chair. My breath caught in my throat. I waited, watching, feeling sweat prick out along my spine despite the autumn chill seeping through the poorly insulated windows. One by one, the other faces turned. The movement was glacial, imperceptible in any single moment, but undeniable when viewed across the span of minutes. They were looking at me, all 4 of them, their hollow eyes and gaping mouths trained on where I sat, trembling in the darkness. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body refused to obey. Muscles locked in a paralysis that felt less like fear and more like submission to some ancient authority I didn't understand. When I finally managed to move, dawn was breaking outside, and the faces had returned to their original positions. The accidents accelerated after that. My wife fell down the stairs, catching herself at the last second on the banister. Her ankle twisted but not broken. The oven caught fire while we slept, filling the brownstone with smoke until the detector's shriek jolted us awake. A shelf collapsed in the bathroom, sending bottles and glass containers crashing down where my wife had been standing just seconds before. Each incident felt targeted, deliberate, as if something was testing the boundaries of what it could do. I stopped sleeping entirely. Instead, I'd sit up through the long hours of darkness, watching the mantelpiece, waiting for that slow, inexorable rotation. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. The unpredictability was worse than any consistent pattern would have been. I began to question everything, my perceptions, my sanity, the fundamental reliability of reality itself. Had the faces really moved, or was my exhausted brain manufacturing patterns from random shadows? Were the accidents truly connected to these 4 pieces of ancient ceramic, or was I suffering some kind of breakdown brought on by stress and insomnia? My wife stopped coming home some nights. She'd stay with friends, she said, or work double shifts at the hospital. I understood. The brownstone had become poisonous, its air thick with presence and watching. Even I wanted to leave. But something kept me tethered to those faces, bound by invisible threads I couldn't sever. The answer came on a Tuesday morning, delivered in a package I didn't remember ordering. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, I found a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. They want to go home. Give them blood, and send them back. The words made my hands shake. How did anyone know about the faces? I'd told no one except my wife, and she certainly hadn't sent this. The handwriting was archaic, letters formed with a careful precision that suggested English wasn't the writer's first language, or maybe it was just very, very old. I found my wife in the kitchen, staring at nothing. When I showed her the note, something flickered across her face. Not quite recognition, but close. Relief, maybe. Or resignation. "Do it," she whispered. "Please. Before something worse happens." That night I stood before the mantelpiece with a box knife in my hand. The faces watched, their empty eyes somehow expectant. My thumb pressed against the blade, and I felt it bite through skin with a sharp, clean pain. Blood welled up, dark in the lamplight, and I let it drip across each face in turn, watching it pool in the hollow eye sockets and run down the screaming mouths like tears. The sensation of relief was immediate and overwhelming. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on the brownstone for weeks lifted suddenly, leaving me gasping. The air felt different, cleaner, lighter, no longer thick with ancient presence. I wrapped the blood-smeared faces in newspaper and bubble wrap, sealing them in a box with shaking hands. The next morning, I shipped them back to Peru. Express international delivery to the merchant's shop in Cusco, the address still saved in my phone. I didn't include a note. I didn't need to. Within a week, everything changed. My wife's hospital offered her a promotion she'd been seeking for years. A contractor called about a project I'd bid on months ago. They wanted me to lead the design team. The brownstone seemed to heal itself, its walls no longer seeping that grave smell, its floors no longer creaking with footsteps I couldn't see. We started sleeping through the night again, dreamless and deep. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt grateful. Instead, I lie awake in the darkness and wonder. The accident stopped too completely, too immediately. Our sudden good fortune feels orchestrated, artificial, like a reward for compliance. Sometimes I catch my wife staring at the empty mantelpiece with an expression I can't read, her eyes distant and strange. Sometimes I find myself reaching for my phone, pulling up the tracking information for that package, watching it move through customs and across continents with an obsession I can't explain. The faces are back in Peru now, back in the earth maybe, back in some market stall waiting for the next collector with more greed than sense. But here's what keeps me awake. Last night, I saw my wife standing in front of the empty mantelpiece at 3 a.m. She was so still I thought she might be sleepwalking. When I whispered her name, she turned to face me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "They're still watching," she said, her voice flat and distant. "They're always watching. You just gave them permission." I told her she was dreaming. I told her to come back to bed. But as I led her away from the living room, I felt it. That familiar prickling at the back of my neck. That animal awareness of observation. I turned back to look at the empty mantelpiece, and in the shadows where those 4 faces once sat, I could have sworn I saw 4 darker patches of darkness, shaped roughly like hollow eyes and screaming mouths. The cut on my thumb throbs sometimes, especially late at night. The scar tissue has healed strangely, raised and ridged in a pattern that looks almost like writing in a language I don't recognize. My wife has started coming home with clay on her hands, even though her hospital shifts shouldn't involve pottery. When I ask about it, she just smiles that strange smile and tells me she's taken up a hobby. Our luck continues to improve. Everything we touch seems to turn to gold. My wife got another promotion. I landed 3 major contracts in a single week. The brownstone's value has increased exponentially according to the latest assessment. We never argue anymore. We never fight. We move through our days with a synchronicity that borders on uncanny, as if we're both following a script written in that same archaic handwriting from the note I received. Sometimes I wonder if the faces ever really left at all. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder if we're the ones who left, if some essential part of us was traded away the moment my blood touched that ancient ceramic, if what walks around in our bodies now is just an echo, a shadow thing wearing our shapes and living our lives, while the real us remains buried somewhere in Andean soil, screaming soundlessly into the dark. The merchant in Cusco never acknowledged receiving the package. The tracking shows it was delivered, signed for, accepted. But when I tried to call the shop, the number was disconnected. When I searched for the address online, I found nothing. Just a blank spot on the map, where a building should have been. My wife doesn't seem concerned. She hummed while making breakfast this morning, her movements fluid and practiced, and when she smiled at me across the table, I noticed for the first time how her eyes have changed. They're darker now, deeper, like hollow sockets filled with shadow. I smiled back, because that's what I'm supposed to do. That's what we do now, in our perfect life, with our perfect luck, in our brownstone that no longer creaks with unseen footsteps, But at night, when my wife's breathing deepens into sleep beside me, I reach up and touch the scar on my thumb. I trace its strange ridges and patterns, and I try to remember what it felt like before the faces, before the blood, before whatever bargain I sealed without understanding the price. The truth is, I don't remember anymore. And that might be the most terrifying thing of all. Because if I can't remember who I was before the faces came home with me, how can I be sure I'm still him? How can any of us be sure we're still ourselves, and not just hollow vessels wearing familiar shapes, moving through familiar routines, while something ancient and patient watches through our eyes? The mantelpiece remains empty, but sometimes, in the peripheral vision I can't quite trust anymore, I see 4 shadows where shadows shouldn't be, 4 familiar shapes with hollow eyes and screaming mouths. And I understand, with a certainty that bypasses logic and reason, that they never needed the ceramic to watch us. They just needed permission, and I gave it to them, willingly, with my own blood. Story 6. The doll arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in newspaper from 1987. I found it waiting on my doorstep when I got home from work. No return address on the small cardboard box, just my name scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside, nestled in tissue paper that crumbled at my touch, sat a porcelain doll about 12 inches tall. Its face was painted with meticulous detail. Rosy cheeks, pursed lips the color of dried blood, and glass eyes that caught the porch light in a way that made them seem wet, alive. The eyes were an unsettling shade of blue, almost gray, the kind of color you see in winter skies before a storm rolls in. I should have thrown it away right then. But my girlfriend at the time collected antiques, and I thought maybe she'd sent it as some kind of surprise, though we'd been fighting more than usual lately, and surprises weren't really her style anymore. I brought it inside and set it on the shelf in the living room, between a stack of unread books and a coffee mug I kept forgetting to wash. The doll wore a Victorian-style dress, cream-colored lace yellowed with age, and its porcelain hands were clasped together as if in prayer. Fine cracks ran through the glaze on its face like dried riverbeds, and one of its tiny shoes was missing. When I positioned it on the shelf, I made sure it faced the wall. Something about those eyes following me across the room made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't quite articulate. That night, I heard the first knock. 3 raps against the front door, deliberate and evenly spaced, came at exactly 2:47 in the morning. I know because I'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me in the darkness. The knocking cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and purposeful. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs, but no second round of knocks came. When I finally worked up the courage to check the peephole, the porch was empty. The street beyond was dark and still, not even a car passing by to disturb the suburban silence. I went back to bed but didn't sleep. The next morning, the doll had moved. I was certain I'd left it facing the wall, but when I stumbled into the living room with my coffee, it had turned around. Now it stared directly into the room, those glass eyes fixed on the exact spot where I sat each evening. My first thought was that I'd simply remembered wrong, that I'd been too tired the night before and had imagined positioning it differently. The human brain does that sometimes, fills in gaps, creates false memories to make sense of uncertainty. I turned it back around and left for work. When I returned that evening, the doll was on the kitchen counter. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, my keys still dangling from my hand, trying to process what I was seeing. The logical part of my brain immediately began constructing explanations. Maybe there had been a small earthquake, tremors I hadn't felt at the office but strong enough to shift objects in the house. Maybe a delivery person had come inside, though that seemed unlikely and deeply concerning for entirely different reasons. Maybe I'd moved it myself this morning in my pre-coffee haze and simply couldn't remember, but I could remember. I remembered leaving it on the shelf, facing the wall, its small form hunched forward like something penitent and ashamed. I picked up the doll, Its porcelain was cold despite the warm air in the house, and carried it back to the living room. This time I laid it flat on its back on the shelf, hidden behind the stack of books. If it was going to move, I wanted to know for certain. I took a photo with my phone, documenting its exact position, the way its dress splayed out around it, the angle of its tiny hands. The knocking came again that night, the same 3 measured raps, but this time at 3:13 in the morning. I was ready this time, already awake, already watching. I'd positioned myself on the couch with a clear view of the front door, determined to catch whoever was doing this. But when the knocks came, I saw nothing. No shadow passed before the peephole. No floorboards creaked on the porch. Just 3 knocks, hollow and resonant, and then silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. I yanked the door open, cold air rushing in to meet me, but the porch was empty. The street was empty. The whole neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. In the distance, a dog barked once and went silent. The streetlight at the corner flickered, buzzed, then steadied. I stood there in my boxers and t-shirt, barefoot on the cold concrete, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, any indication that I wasn't losing my mind. Nothing. No one. When I turned back inside, I saw the doll through the doorway. It was sitting upright on the coffee table facing me. I had left it lying flat on the shelf behind the books. I had photographic evidence, but there it sat, perfectly positioned as if placed by careful hands, its glass eyes reflecting the pale light from the street, twin points of cold luminescence in the darkness of my living room. My hands were shaking as I approached it. The house suddenly felt too large, too full of shadows and corners and spaces I couldn't see. I picked up my phone and checked the photo I'd taken. There it was, lying flat, hidden behind the books, exactly as I remembered. I looked at the timestamp. 8 hours ago. I'd been in the house, alone, for most of that time. I grabbed the doll, its porcelain cold enough to hurt my hands, and shoved it into a shoebox. I carried the box to my bedroom closet, buried it under a pile of winter coats I hadn't worn in years, and closed the door firmly. The knob clicked into place with a sound that seemed too loud in the silent house. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house settling, every whisper of wind against the windows made me tense. The darkness in my bedroom felt textured, thick, as if I could reach out and feel its substance. I kept imagining I heard something moving in the closet, the soft scrape of porcelain against cardboard, the rustle of tissue paper. But each time I turned on the light, everything was still. I woke up at 6, my alarm jarring me from dreams I couldn't quite remember, but that left me feeling anxious and watched. The closet door was still closed. I checked before I even got out of bed, my eyes drawn to it immediately, needing that confirmation. For a moment, I felt relieved. Maybe I'd solved the problem. Maybe burying it in the closet had broken whatever strange pattern was developing. Then I went to make coffee and found the doll sitting on my pillow. Not near my pillow, not beside it, on it. Right where my head had been resting all night. It was positioned sitting up, legs extended, hands in its lap, facing the foot of the bed. Facing exactly where I'd been sleeping. The morning light coming through the window made its eyes shine, gave them depth they shouldn't have had, made them look less like painted glass and more like something watching, waiting, remembering. I didn't touch it this time. I couldn't. The thought of putting my hands on it again made my stomach turn. Instead, I backed out of the room slowly, my eyes never leaving it, and called in sick to work. My voice sounded strange on the phone, hollow and distant, as if I were listening to someone else make the call. The day passed in a blur of anxiety and mounting dread. I tried to research the doll online, searching for any information about moving antiques or haunted objects, but everything I found seemed theatrical and fake, designed for entertainment rather than practical help. I avoided my bedroom entirely, spending the day on the couch, periodically checking my phone for messages that never came. The house felt different in the daylight, less oppressive but somehow more artificial, as if it were just a stage set waiting for night to fall and the real performance to begin. I knew I should throw the doll away, take it to a dumpster far from my house. but some part of me resisted. What if moving it outside made things worse? What if it just kept coming back? These thoughts circled through my mind like vultures, irrational but persistent. As evening approached, the light through the windows turned golden, then orange, then began to fade. I made myself go back to the bedroom. The doll was still there, still sitting on my pillow, but now its head was turned slightly to the side, as if it had been watching the door, waiting for my return. I was certain its head had been facing forward before. Almost certain. The uncertainty gnawed at me, made me question my own perception. I grabbed it quickly, not letting myself think about it, and carried it outside. My hands were sweating despite the cool evening air. I walked 3 blocks to a small park, found a trash can near the empty playground, and dropped the doll inside, shoebox and all. It landed with a dull thud on top of someone's fast food wrappers and a crushed soda can. I didn't look back as I walked away, but I could feel those eyes following me, burning into my back like twin points of cold fire. The relief I felt was immense but short-lived. That night, lying in bed, I kept listening for the knocks. They didn't come. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning, then 2. I started to relax, started to think maybe it was over. Maybe the doll had been the problem, and removing it had solved everything. Maybe I could chalk this whole experience up to stress and poor sleep and an overactive imagination. At 3:37 in the morning, I heard something in the house. Not knocking this time. Footsteps. Small, deliberate footsteps coming from the living room. The sound was distinct, impossible to misidentify. They were too light to be human, too regular to be my imagination. The floorboards in my house creaked in specific places. I knew them all, had mapped them out over the years of living here. And something was walking across them now, one careful step at a time, moving from the living room toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. I couldn't move. I lay there frozen, my entire body rigid with fear, listening to those impossible footsteps getting closer. They reached the hallway. They continued down it, unhurried, purposeful. They stopped right outside my bedroom door. Silence. Long, stretching silence. I stared at the door, at the thin line of darkness beneath it, waiting for I don't know what. A shadow. Movement. Something. Then came the knock. Just one this time, soft and almost polite, against my bedroom door. I don't remember getting out of bed, but suddenly I was on my feet. I yanked open the door, ready to confront whoever or whatever was out there, ready for anything except what I found. The hallway was empty. The house was silent. But there, sitting in the exact center of the hallway floor, positioned as carefully as if placed by loving hands, was the doll. It wasn't in the shoebox anymore. It sat with its legs straight out in front of it, its hands in its lap, its head tilted slightly to one side. Its dress was somehow cleaner than before, the lace whiter, less yellowed, and its eyes, those glass eyes that had bothered me from the beginning, seemed darker now, deeper, as if the paint behind them had thickened or the light was hitting them differently. I grabbed my phone and called my girlfriend, my ex-girlfriend, whoever she was at this point. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice heavy with sleep and annoyance, and I started talking too fast, telling her about the doll, about the knocking, about the footsteps. She listened for a moment, then cut me off, her tone sharp with something between concern and exasperation. She told me she hadn't sent any package. She told me to get some sleep. She told me stress does strange things to people. Then she hung up. I stood there in the hallway, my phone still pressed to my ear, listening to dead air, staring at the doll. In the silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and irregular, and beneath it, something else. A sound so faint I almost missed it. The soft scrape of porcelain against hardwood, as if the doll had just shifted its weight, just adjusted its position ever so slightly. I picked it up. Its surface was no longer cold. It was warm, almost body temperature, and that somehow made everything worse. I carried it to the garage, opened the large metal trash can we used for yard waste, and threw it in. Then I went inside, locked the door, and pushed my heavy workbench against it. The scrape of wood on concrete was loud in the night silence. Final. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, all the lights in the house turned on, and waited for morning. Every sound made me jump. The refrigerator humming to life, the house settling, the wind against the windows. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again, that soft knock, but they never came. When dawn finally broke, gray light filtering through the windows, I went to check the garage. I needed to know. I moved the workbench, unlocked the door, and approached the trash can. My hands were shaking as I lifted the lid. The doll was gone. The trash can was empty except for some dried leaves and an old paint can. I spent the day searching every inch of my house, looking in every closet, under every piece of furniture, behind every door. I found nothing. The doll had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving no trace except for the small indentations in my carpet where it had sat, and those might have been there all along. The knocking stopped. The footsteps stopped. Everything went back to normal, or something approximating normal. Days passed, then weeks. I started sleeping through the night again. The house felt like mine once more, familiar and safe. I told myself it had all been stress, a psychological break brought on by too many late nights and the slow dissolution of a relationship. The human mind is capable of strange things when pushed to its limits. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up convinced I hear something moving in the darkness. Sometimes I could swear I see the impression of small hands on my pillow, or catch a faint smell of old paper and porcelain dust. And sometimes, when I'm half asleep and not quite conscious, I think I feel something watching me from the corner of the room, waiting patiently, its glass eyes reflecting whatever faint light manages to penetrate the darkness. I never found out who sent the doll. I never found out where it went. And I never saw it again, though I catch myself looking for it sometimes, checking behind doors and inside closets, searching for that small porcelain face with its two blue eyes and its expression of patient, eternal waiting. The worst part isn't the uncertainty about what happened. The worst part is knowing that somewhere out there, that doll still exists. It's sitting on someone's shelf, or lying in someone's attic, or waiting in some antique store for the next person to take it home. And whoever finds it next will bring it inside, set it down somewhere safe, and maybe, if they're unlucky, they'll wake up one night to the sound of 3 measured knocks, echoing through the silence like a promise, or a warning, or an invitation they never asked for. I moved out of that house 6 months later. The official reason was a job opportunity in another city, but that wasn't the whole truth. I couldn't stay there anymore, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was waiting for me to let my guard down. The new tenants seemed happy there. I drove past once a few months after moving and saw lights in the windows, heard laughter from the backyard. I wonder if they've found anything unusual yet. I wonder if they hear knocking late at night. I wonder if they've noticed anything out of place, anything moving when it shouldn't. But I never called them, never warned them. How do you explain something like that without sounding insane? How do you tell someone their house might be haunted by something that may or may not have ever existed outside of your deteriorating mental state? So I keep quiet, and I try not to think about it. But every now and then, when I'm unpacking boxes in my new apartment or rearranging furniture, I find myself stopping, listening, waiting for 3 measured knocks that never come. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I wake up certain that I'm not alone, that something is sitting in the darkness watching me with patient glass eyes, waiting for I don't know what. The doll never came back. But I think part of me is still waiting for it, will always be waiting for it, listening in the silence for the sound of small footsteps and that soft, polite knock at the door. And maybe that's the real horror, not what happened, but the fact that I'll never know for certain if any of it was real, or if I simply created a monster out of porcelain and paranoia, and let it hollow me out from the inside. Some nights I dream about it. In the dreams, I'm back in my old house, and the doll is there, sitting on the shelf where I first placed it, facing the wall. I walk over to turn it around, to see its face one more time, to confirm that it was just an object, just a thing made of clay and paint and glass. But when I reach for it, my hand passes through it like smoke, and I wake up with my heart pounding, my sheets soaked with sweat, convinced I can hear something moving in the darkness just beyond my vision. I've thought about trying to find it, to track down where it came from, to solve this mystery once and for all. But I never do, because deep down, I'm afraid of what I might discover. I'm afraid that if I pull that thread, if I start asking those questions, the doll might find its way back to me. And this time, I don't think I could handle it. This time, I don't think I'd survive with whatever fragile grip on reality I still maintain. So I leave it alone. I let it exist in that uncertain space between real and imagined, between truth and delusion. And I try to move forward with my life, try to be normal, try to forget. But I can't forget those eyes. I can't forget the way they caught the light, the way they seemed to hold depth and intelligence and something else I couldn't name. And I can't forget the feeling of being watched, of being studied, of being the subject of some incomprehensible attention from something that shouldn't have been aware at all. The doll is gone. I am safe. Everything is normal. I tell myself these things every night before I sleep. And most nights, I almost believe them. Almost. Story 7. The first time I saw her, I convinced myself it was the afternoon light playing tricks through Grandma's lace curtains. I'd been staying at the old Victorian for 3 weeks, settling her estate after the funeral. The lawyer said someone needed to be present while the property was prepared for sale, and being the only grandson who could take time off work, the duty fell to me. The house sat on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown gardens that hadn't been tended in years. Grandma had become increasingly reclusive in her final decade, and the property showed it. Paint peeling like dead skin, shutters hanging crooked, the whole structure sagging as if exhausted by the weight of its own history. I was cataloging items in the parlor when movement caught my peripheral vision, just a flicker, there and gone, near the doorway that led to the dining room. When I turned my head fully, nothing. But the air felt different somehow, charged with a static quality that made the hair on my forearms stand up. The afternoon sun filtered through those heavy curtains, creating pools of amber light that seemed almost liquid, and I told myself that's all it was. Shadow and illumination, conspiring to conjure shapes where none existed. The second time happened 4 days later. I'd been sorting through boxes in the attic, surrounded by decades of accumulated memories packed away and forgotten. Photograph albums with cracked leather covers, newspaper clippings yellowed to the color of old bone, a collection of porcelain dolls that watched me with their glassy, unblinking stares. The attic smelled of dust and something else, something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. My back was to the stairs when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being observed. You know the feeling. That primitive awareness that tightens your shoulders and quickens your pulse. A holdover from when our ancestors needed to sense predators in tall grass. I turned slowly, every nerve suddenly alert. She stood at the top of the stairs. Not stood, hovered. That's the only word that fits. A figure, small and slender, wearing what looked like a white dress from another era. High collar, long sleeves, the kind of thing you'd see in photographs from the early 1900s. But here's what made my breath catch. I could see through her. Not completely transparent, but translucent, like looking at someone through wax paper. The light from the single attic bulb passed through her form and continued onto the wall behind, where it cast no shadow. I blinked hard, squeezed my eyes shut, and opened them again. She remained. Her features were indistinct, blurred at the edges like an overexposed photograph. But I could make out enough to see she was young, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. Her hair hung in long waves that seemed to move with a breeze I couldn't feel. She wasn't looking at me directly. Her gaze was fixed on something over my shoulder, or perhaps through me entirely, focused on some distant point I couldn't perceive. My mouth had gone dry. I tried to speak, managed only a choked sound that might have been the beginning of a word. The figure didn't react. She simply faded, gradually becoming more transparent until she was nothing more than a disturbance in the air, and then even that was gone. I descended those attic stairs faster than was safe, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the railing with both hands. In the kitchen, I poured myself 3 fingers of the bourbon I'd found in Grandma's cabinet, drinking it neat despite the burn. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Stress, grief does strange things to perception. I'd been working too hard, sleeping poorly in an unfamiliar bed, surrounded by reminders of death and loss. The mind can generate all sorts of hallucinations under such conditions. But that evening, as I sat in the living room with every light in the house blazing, I couldn't shake the memory of how real she'd seemed, how the air had felt different when she was present, heavier somehow, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? That I was seeing ghosts in my dead grandmother's house? They'd think the isolation was getting to me, suggest I hire someone else to handle the estate. So I kept quiet and tried to lose myself in work, spending long hours going through closets and cupboards, boxing up a lifetime of possessions for donation or disposal. The house seemed to watch me as I moved through its rooms. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd heard footsteps on the stairs or the creak of floorboards in an empty room. At night, the old structure settled with groans and sighs that sounded almost vocal, as if it were speaking in a language just below the threshold of comprehension. I started keeping the bourbon bottle on the nightstand. 3 weeks after my first glimpse of the transparent figure, I saw her again, this time in broad daylight, standing in the garden outside the kitchen window. I'd been washing dishes when I looked up, and there she was, among the overgrown roses and tangled honeysuckle. The same translucent quality, the same early century dress, the same unsettling stillness. She was facing the house, and though I still couldn't make out her features clearly, I had the distinct impression she was looking directly at me. I dropped the plate I'd been holding. It shattered in the sink with a sound like breaking bones. By the time I looked up again, she was gone. I rushed to the back door, threw it open, and stepped into the garden. The afternoon was warm, humid, thick with the scent of honeysuckle and decay. Nothing moved except the insects droning through the heavy air. The grass where she'd stood showed no impression, no sign that anyone had been there at all. That's when I started researching the house's history. The local library had archived newspapers going back to the town's founding. I spent 2 full days scrolling through microfiche, searching for anything that might explain what I was seeing. The house had been in our family since 1903, built by my great-great-grandfather. He'd been a physician, well respected in the community. His wife had died young, no cause listed, just that she'd passed peacefully in her sleep in 1912. I found a few other items of note. A brief mention of a fire in 1918, minor damage, quickly repaired. A notice about my great-grandfather's birth in 1910, but nothing that would explain a transparent figure in period dress. No tragic deaths, no mysterious disappearances. Nothing that would fit the typical ghost story narrative. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was trying to tell me something. The atmosphere began to change after my third sighting. The air inside felt thicker, more oppressive, as if the house were exhaling something invisible but tangible. Rooms I'd left warm and bright would turn cold when I returned, my breath misting in front of my face despite the summer heat outside. The smell that had been faint in the attic, that organic floral sweetness, began appearing in other rooms, strongest in the parlor and the upstairs hallway. I started seeing things in my peripheral vision constantly. Flickers of movement just at the edge of my sight, gone when I turned to look. Shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Once, I could have sworn I saw the lace curtains in the dining room being pulled aside by invisible hands, though no breeze stirred the air. My sleep deteriorated. When I did manage to doze off, I'd wake with the certainty that someone had been standing beside the bed, watching me sleep. The impression would be so strong I could almost feel the weight of their gaze lingering on my skin. I'd lie there in the darkness, heart hammering, too frightened to open my eyes fully, listening to the house breathe around me. I began to question my own sanity. Was I experiencing some kind of breakdown? The isolation was getting to me, I knew that much. I'd been alone in this decaying house for over a month now, surrounded by death and memory. Maybe my mind was simply fracturing under the strain, generating these visions as some kind of coping mechanism. Or maybe there was something wrong with me neurologically. A tumor, perhaps, pressing on the parts of my brain responsible for visual processing and spatial awareness. But then I'd remember how real she'd looked, how the air had changed when she appeared, how my body had responded with genuine primal fear. Hallucinations might trick the eyes, but could they fool every sense? Could they alter the temperature of a room or conjure smells from nothing? The fourth sighting came on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was setting. I'd been in the basement sorting through old furniture and wondering what antique dealers might pay for some of the better pieces. The basement was the one part of the house I'd been avoiding. It was dark down there even with all the lights on, the air dank and still, the concrete walls weeping moisture. But I'd finally forced myself to deal with it. Anxious to finish this whole ordeal and return to my normal life, I was examining an old wardrobe, running my hand along the carved wood, when I felt it again. That pressure, that awareness. I turned, and she was there, not 10 feet away, standing beside the water heater. This time, she was clearer. I could make out more details. The tiny buttons running up the front of her dress, the ribbon tied in her hair, the shape of her hands clasped in front of her. She still had that translucent quality, that see-through appearance, but the edges were sharper now, more defined. And this time I was certain she was looking directly at me. We remained frozen like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. My chest felt tight, compressed, as if the air had turned solid. The smell of flowers was overwhelming now, so strong it made my eyes water. Then she moved. Just a slight turn of her head, a shift in posture, but it shattered the paralysis that had gripped me. I stumbled backward, knocking into a stack of boxes that crashed to the floor. When I looked up again, she was gone. But the basement felt different now, charged with an energy I could almost taste on my tongue, metallic and strange. I ran. Actually ran up those basement stairs, not caring how it looked or who might see, driven by a fear so pure and absolute it overrode every other consideration. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the driveway in the gathering dusk, gasping for air like I'd been drowning. That night I seriously considered leaving, just packing my things and driving away, letting the lawyers handle the rest. But where would I go? Back to my empty apartment? And what would I tell them? That I couldn't finish the job because I was being haunted? So I stayed. But I moved all my belongings to the guest bedroom on the first floor, the room farthest from the basement stairs. I kept lights on throughout the night. I left the television running constantly, just for the noise, the reassurance of voices, even if they were recorded. I stopped going into certain rooms entirely. The attic, the basement, even the parlor where I'd had my first glimpse of her. The house seemed to sense my fear. I know how that sounds, but I can't describe it any other way. The building itself felt aware, conscious, responding to my presence with a kind of malevolent attention. Doors I'd left open would be closed when I returned. Objects moved from where I'd placed them. Once I found a photograph on the kitchen table, one I'd never seen before, showing a young figure in a white dress standing in the garden, her face too blurred to make out clearly. I didn't remember putting it there. I was certain I hadn't put it there. The final week was the worst. The transparent figure appeared almost daily now, always unexpected, always in different locations. I'd see her reflection in windows, her silhouette on the landing, her form standing in the garden at dawn. Each sighting left me more shaken than the last. My nerves stretched to the breaking point. I stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping more than an hour or two at a time. My hands developed a constant tremor. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the gaunt, hollow-eyed face staring back at me. I looked haunted, literally and figuratively. Then, on my last night in the house, everything changed. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving back and forth, back and forth, with a rhythm that suggested pacing. I lay rigid in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, listening to those impossible sounds. Whatever was making them stopped directly outside my door. The doorknob began to turn. I watched it rotate slowly, the old brass mechanism catching and clicking. The door swung open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. Nothing there, just empty space and shadow. But the smell poured in. That floral sweetness, now so intense it was almost nauseating. And with it came cold, a frigid air that turned my breath to vapor. She appeared in the doorway, clearer than I'd ever seen her. Fully formed, substantial, though still with that otherworldly translucence. She stood perfectly still, her face finally visible enough for me to take in the details. Young features, wide eyes, an expression I couldn't quite read. Not menacing, not sad, just present, observing, recording. We looked at each other across the darkness of that room, and something passed between us. Understanding, maybe, or just recognition. I wasn't afraid anymore. The terror that had gripped me for weeks had burned itself out, leaving only a strange, numb acceptance. She raised one hand, slowly, as if pointing at something behind me. I turned to look, following her gesture to the wall where an old mirror hung. In its reflection, I could see the room, the bed, myself sitting there with my back to the glass. But I could also see her, standing in the doorway, and behind her, barely visible, another figure, and another, and others still, layered one over another, transparent forms extending back through the doorway and down the hall, a procession of overlapping existence, all of them wearing clothes from different eras, all of them watching. When I turned back to face the doorway directly, there was nothing there, just empty space. But in the mirror, they remained. I left at dawn, throwing my belongings into my car with shaking hands. I called the lawyer from the road, told him I was done, the house was his problem now. He tried to ask questions, but I hung up. I didn't owe him or anyone else an explanation. 6 months passed. I tried to forget about the house, about what I'd seen there. I threw myself into work, into routine, into anything that might crowd out the memories, but they clung to me like cobwebs, impossible to fully shake off. I'd catch myself staring at reflections, looking for figures that weren't there. I'd wake in the night, certain I'd heard footsteps in my apartment hallway. Then I got the call from the lawyer. The house had been sold. The new owner was moving in next week. Did I want any final say in items that hadn't been disposed of? I said no. I wanted nothing more from that house. But 3 weeks later, another call came. This one from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was female, young, breathless with excitement or fear. I couldn't tell which. She explained that she'd gotten my number from the lawyer, that she was the new owner of my grandmother's house. She'd been living there for just over 2 weeks. There was a pause, filled with the crackle of a poor connection. Then, I need to ask you something, and I know it's going to sound crazy, but did you, when you were staying here, did you ever see anything? Anything unusual? My blood ran cold. What did you see? Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, uncertain. A figure, transparent, wearing an old-fashioned white dress. She appears in different rooms, just standing there watching. I've seen her 4 times now. I thought I was losing my mind, but then I found some old photographs in the basement and... She continued talking, but I'd stopped listening. The phone felt heavy in my hand, impossibly heavy, dragging my arm down with its weight. I wanted to tell her to leave, to get out of that house immediately, to run and never look back. But what good would that do? If it was real, if any of it was real, would leaving help? Or would those images follow her too, the way they'd followed me? And if it wasn't real, if it was all some shared delusion or trick of the mind, then what did that say about the house itself? What was it about that place that could make people see things that shouldn't exist? I told her I'd seen similar things. I told her I couldn't explain them, I told her she'd have to decide for herself what to do with that information. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment as evening shadows lengthened across the walls. I thought about the house, about all the years it had stood there on the edge of town, about all the people who'd lived within its walls, died within its walls, left their impressions somehow embedded in its bones. I thought about the figures I'd seen layered in that mirror, overlapping existences bleeding through from different times. I thought about how the new owner had described seeing the same transparent girl, the same white dress, the same watching presence. And I wondered, when she looked in the mirrors, would she see me there too? Another translucent figure added to the procession, another observer trapped in the house's memory, doomed to be glimpsed by whoever came next? I don't know the answer to that. I hope I never find out. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I catch myself checking my reflection, looking for signs of transparency, testing my substance against the solid world, making sure I'm still completely here. Most of the time I am. Most of the time. Story 8. The first time I saw them, I convinced myself it was the heat. August in the Panhandle does things to your vision. Shimmers rising off the hard pan, distances collapsing and expanding like breathing. I'd been checking fence lines since dawn, and the sun had turned the world into a furnace. The old water tower rose from the eastern pasture like a skeletal finger, rusted red against the bleached sky. I'd driven past it 100 times without giving it a second thought, but that day something made me slow the truck. They stood in a line beneath it. 3 figures, perfectly still. The distance made details impossible, but their poseness struck me immediately. The unnatural way they faced the highway, parallel to the fence line, as if waiting for something that would never arrive. A man, a woman, and between them a shape that suggested another adult, though the heat distortion made certainty impossible. They didn't move, not a shift of weight, not a turn of head, just that fixed forward stare. I killed the engine, feeling sweat trace down my spine. The silence pressed against my eardrums. No wind, no cattle lowing, nothing but the tick of cooling metal and my own breathing. I should have called out, should have driven closer. Instead, I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, watching them watch nothing. The moment stretched, my pulse thundered in my throat. Then I blinked, and they were gone. Not walked away, not dissolved into heat shimmer, just absent, as if they'd been erased between one heartbeat and the next. The space beneath the tower showed nothing but yellowed grass and shadow. I stared until my eyes watered, searching for any sign of movement, any explanation. The logical part of my brain supplied reasonable answers, transients maybe, or ranch hands from the neighboring property. But the prickling sensation crawling up my arms wasn't interested in logic. I drove home without finishing the fence check. Told myself I'd come back in the cooler evening hours. Told myself a lot of things that day. The ranch hands mentioned the tower that night over dinner. We were eating on the bunkhouse porch, the day's heat finally breaking into something bearable, when Tommy brought it up. He was new, barely 3 weeks on the property, and still had that eagerness that gets worn down by the routine. "Anyone ever go up in that old tower?" he asked, gesturing vaguely eastward with his fork. The other men went quiet. Even the scrape of utensils against plates seemed to pause. Old Pete, who'd worked the ranch longer than I'd been alive, set down his coffee with deliberate care. "Nobody goes near the tower," he said, his voice carrying a weight that killed Tommy's smile. "Hasn't been used in 20 years. Not safe." But it wasn't the structure's safety that threaded through his words. Something else lurked in his tone, something that made the other men suddenly find their food fascinating. I felt that crawling sensation return, skittering across my shoulders. "I saw something out there today," I heard myself say. The words came out before I could stop them. People, 3 of them, just standing underneath it. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to suffocate. Pete's weathered face had gone carefully blank, that expression old men get when they're deciding how much truth to tell. Finally, he spoke, barely above a murmur. Ranch used to belong to the Hendersons. Lost it in the drought of 2003. Family lived in that little house by the eastern property line. You can still see the foundation if you know where to look. He paused, working his jaw. Found them in their car. All three of them. Been sitting there in the August heat for near a week before anyone thought to check on them. Engine running the whole time. Parked right by the highway fence. Jesus, Tommy breathed. That's just old ghost stories, another hand interjected, but his voice lacked conviction. Pete shrugged, but his eyes found mine across the table. In them, I saw recognition. The look of someone who'd seen something that defied comfortable explanation. Maybe. But folks say they still wait there, still watching that highway, like they never stopped. I tried to sleep that night, tried and failed. The bunkhouse creaked and settled around me, full of the small sounds of sleeping men, but my mind kept returning to those three figures, the absolute stillness of them, the way they'd simply vanished. Heat, I told myself. Just heat and an old man's stories. But I knew I'd be going back to the tower. The weeks that followed were unnaturally quiet. I finished my work, kept my head down, and didn't mention what I'd seen again. But the tower drew my eyes constantly. Every time I drove past, I'd slow slightly, scanning the space beneath it, looking for that frozen tableau. The grass there seemed yellower than the surrounding pasture, as if something had bleached the life from it. Or maybe I just wanted to see patterns, to make meaning from random chance. September brought relief from the worst heat, though the days still shimmered. I'd started taking different routes when I could, avoiding the eastern pasture, but the ranch only had so many roads. One afternoon, mechanical trouble with the north windmill forced me back toward the tower. The sun hung low and swollen, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. I told myself I wouldn't look, kept my eyes on the rutted track ahead, focused on the rhythmic bump of tires over uneven ground. But peripheral vision is a traitor. Movement flickered at the edge of my sight, and my head snapped toward the tower before conscious thought could intervene. She stood alone this time. The figure was distinct despite the distance. A woman in white, her dress or gown catching the failing light. But it was the movement that locked my breath in my chest. While everything else in that vast landscape held perfectly still, she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she raised one pale arm and waved. The gesture was wrong. Too slow, too measured. Like watching film played at half speed. The fabric of her clothing whipped and billowed in a wind I couldn't feel, couldn't hear. My truck sat in dead calm, but she moved in a gale, her arms sweeping through that languid arc again and again. I don't remember stopping the truck, don't remember cutting the engine, but suddenly I was standing outside, one hand still gripping the doorframe, staring across the distance at this impossible thing. The rational part of my mind screamed explanations. Someone playing a prank, a trick of light, anything. But my body knew better. My body understood, at some primal level, that I was seeing something that shouldn't be seen. She continued waving. That patient, persistent gesture, not beckoning exactly, more like acknowledgement, recognition, like she'd been waiting for me specifically. The sun slipped lower, and shadows stretched like reaching fingers. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The distance between us felt both vast and negligible, as if reality had gone fluid, as if I could somehow step across that space in a single stride. The thought terrified me. Then the wind hit, a genuine gust that bent the grass and rattled the truck. I threw up an arm against the dust, and when I lowered it, the tower stood empty again. No figure, no movement, just the dying day and my own ragged breathing. This time I didn't go home, couldn't face the knowing looks, the questions I wouldn't be able to answer. Instead, I drove to town, to the small historical society tucked above the feed store. The woman who ran it looked surprised to see anyone that late, but she unlocked the door and let me in among the dusty archives and yellowed photographs. "Looking for anything specific?" she asked. "The Henderson family, the ones who died in '03. Her expression shifted. sympathy mixing with something more complex. She knew the story. Of course she knew. Everyone in these small towns knows the tragedies, passes them down like heirlooms. She pulled a folder from a filing cabinet, handling it with the care reserved for things that hurt. The photographs inside were mundane and heartbreaking in their ordinariness. A family standing in front of a modest house, father, mother, and a grown daughter, all squinting into bright sunlight, smiling, alive. The next few images showed the same people at various gatherings, celebrations, normal moments frozen in time. Carbon monoxide poisoning, the woman said quietly. They'd pulled off the highway to wait out some car trouble, kept the engine running for the air conditioning. Exhaust leak they didn't know about. She paused. The coroner said they probably didn't suffer, just fell asleep and never woke up. I studied their faces, looking for something I couldn't name. The daughter in particular drew my eye. Tall, thin, with light hair that the photograph's age had turned nearly white. Something about the way she stood, slightly apart from her parents, looking not at the camera but past it, toward some distant point. They say she liked to walk out to that old tower, the woman continued, before it happened. Her mother used to worry she'd get hurt on the property, but she'd go anyway. Said she liked watching the highway, watching people go places. My skin prickled. What was she wearing? When they found them? The woman's face went carefully neutral. White dress. She'd been somewhere nice that day before. Wedding, I think, or maybe a graduation. She closed the folder. Why are you asking about this? I couldn't answer. Couldn't explain the cold certainty spreading through my chest. Instead, I thanked her and left, walking out into a night that suddenly felt too big, too empty. The rational explanations crumbled after that. I tried to maintain them, tried to construct frameworks of coincidence and overactive imagination, but they fell apart under the weight of what I knew. I'd seen them, both times, and something in that tower's shadow was waiting. October brought storms and the kind of darkness that swallows the land completely. I'd stopped sleeping properly, existing in a state of exhausted awareness that made everything feel slightly unreal. The other ranch hands noticed but said nothing. Probably thought I was having woman trouble, or money problems, or any of the normal concerns that hollow out a man. They didn't know I'd started seeing her everywhere. Not physically, not like before, but in peripheral vision, in reflections, in the corner of my eye when I turned too quickly. A pale suggestion of movement, there and gone. The waving gesture repeated in my dreams, that slow, deliberate arc that seemed to pull at something deep in my chest. I started researching, spent my evenings in town libraries and archives, digging through newspaper microfiche and county records. The Henderson story was documented, tragic, and simple, but other stories clustered around that tower, reaching back decades. Workers who'd quit without explanation, reported sightings that everyone dismissed, a rancher in the 80s who'd tried to tear the structure down, only to have his equipment fail repeatedly until he gave up. The tower predated the Hendersons by 40 years. Originally built to service the property when it had been much larger, serving multiple families. I found records of other deaths, other tragedies, a drowning in the stock tank nearby, a worker killed when scaffolding collapsed during tower maintenance, a woman who'd walked out into a blizzard and never returned. All of them connected to that single point in the landscape. The more I learned, the less I understood. The tower had become a collection point for something, a gravity well for tragedy, or maybe it had always been that way, and we'd just built our structures on top of something older, something that didn't care about our fences and property lines. I should have left, should have packed my things and found work on another ranch, put distance between myself and that haunted ground. But I couldn't. Something held me there, a hook lodged deep. Every morning I'd tell myself this was the day I'd give notice, and every evening I'd find myself driving past the tower again, checking for those figures, for that waving woman in white. The second time I saw them all together came in November, during an early cold snap that frosted the grass and turned breath to fog. I'd been checking cattle in the eastern pasture, ensuring they had access to unfrozen water. The tower rose from the morning mist like something emerging from deep time, and I knew before I looked that they'd be there. All three stood in their line again, facing the highway, but closer this time, much closer. They'd crossed perhaps half the distance between the tower and where I'd first seen them, standing now in the middle of the pasture. The detail available at this new proximity made my stomach clench. They were translucent. Not invisible, not quite, but I could see through them to the grass and fence line beyond. The father stood rigid, one arm slightly extended as if reaching for something. The mother's head tilted at an angle that suggested she'd turned to look at her daughter in the moment before everything ended. And the daughter, she faced forward, toward the highway, her expression slack with the kind of patient waiting that has no end. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The cold air burned in my lungs, and my hands had gone numb around the steering wheel. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. But I felt seen anyway, observed with an attention that had nothing to do with eyes or vision. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, they began to fade, not vanishing like before, but slowly becoming less substantial, like ink diluting in water. I watched them dissolve into the morning air, watched until only the faintest suggestion remained, then nothing at all. My radio crackled, Pete's voice tinny and distant, asking if I'd finished the cattle check. I couldn't respond, couldn't make my hand reach for the transmitter. I sat there as the sun burned away the mist, revealing an empty pasture where three impossible things had stood. When I finally returned to the ranch house, Pete took one look at my face and poured whiskey into coffee without asking. The other hands made themselves scarce. We sat on the porch in silence for a long time before he spoke. "My grandfather worked this ranch," he said, staring at the horizon. "Told me once that some places hold on to things. Grief, trauma, whatever you want to call it. Said the tower was like that. A place where something went wrong, way back before any of us, and it never stopped being wrong." He glanced at me, said the trick was not to look too close, not to engage, because once you do, once they know you can see them. He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Once they know, what? Pete's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then you're part of it. Part of whatever's waiting there. The words settled over me like a cold blanket. How do I make it stop? Can't. He said it simply, without inflection. You just live with it, and you don't go near that tower, ever. But I knew I would. Knew it with the same certainty I knew my own name. The hook had set completely now, and some part of me understood that I'd been marked from that first sighting. That first moment of eye contact across a heat-shimmered distance. The tower was calling, and I was answering, even as every rational thought screamed at me to run. December came with hard freezes and skies the color of steel. The ranch slowed its rhythm, settling into winter's reduced schedule. I should have felt relief, but the quiet only amplified my awareness of the tower's presence. It dominated my thoughts, invaded my sleep. I'd wake in darkness with the certainty that someone stood at the foot of my bed, waving slowly, patiently. The hands started avoiding me. I caught their uneasy glances, heard their conversations die when I entered a room. Pete tried to talk to me once, suggesting I take some time off, maybe visit family. But I had no family, had nothing but this ranch and the growing certainty that something waited for me in that eastern pasture. The third sighting happened on Christmas Eve. Most of the hands had gone home for the holiday, leaving the ranch nearly deserted. I volunteered to stay, to handle the essential work. The real reason went unspoken. I needed to be here, needed to be available. The afternoon light had that winter quality, thin and sharp, when I drove out to check the stock tanks. I didn't fight it anymore. Didn't pretend I was going anywhere but toward the tower. The truck seemed to know the way, following the familiar ruts without conscious guidance from my hands. They stood waiting in a semicircle at the tower's base, all three, closer than they'd ever been. Close enough that I could see their faces clearly despite the impossible translucence of their forms. The father's expression showed confusion, as if he couldn't quite understand where he was or how he'd gotten there. The mother looked sad, resigned. But the daughter, She smiled. A small, knowing smile that suggested she'd been expecting me. She raised her arm and waved. That same slow, deliberate gesture, but now I could see the invitation in it. The welcome. The recognition that I was finally ready to understand what they'd been trying to show me. I opened the truck door, put one foot on the ground. The cold bit through my jeans, but I barely felt it. Everything had narrowed to that gap between where I stood and where they waited. So easy to cross. So simple to just walk forward, to finally understand what they understood, to stop fighting the pull that had dragged at me for months. The daughter's smile widened. She lowered her arm, and all three of them turned as one to face the highway. Waiting. Always waiting. And I understood finally what they were waiting for. Not rescue, not escape, just company. Someone else to stand in that eternal vigil, watching the world move past while they remained forever fixed. I wanted to move forward, wanted it with an intensity that frightened me. My legs tensed, ready to step into whatever ceremony they offered. The tower's shadow stretched toward me like a path. Then my radio crackled. Pete's voice, asking if I was almost finished, reminding me that dinner was getting cold. The sound was absurdly normal, a tether to the mundane world I'd been slowly leaving behind. The spell broke. I sucked in air, realizing I'd been holding my breath. When I looked back at the tower, they were gone. But something had changed. The space beneath the structure seemed darker, more defined, less empty, and I knew with horrible certainty that a fourth figure would appear there eventually, that the invitation remained open, that every time I drove past, every time I looked toward that eastern pasture, I was accepting a little more of whatever waited there. I got back in the truck with hands that shook so badly I could barely grip the wheel. Drove back to the ranch house without looking in the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see reflected there. Pete took one look at me and said nothing, just handed me a plate of food I couldn't taste and whiskey I couldn't feel. That night I packed my things. Told Pete I was leaving in the morning, that I'd found work elsewhere. He nodded, unsurprised, and shook my hand with what felt like relief. We both knew I was lying. We both knew I wouldn't make it past the property line before the pull brought me back. Because here's what I've come to understand. Some things attach themselves to you, and once they do, there's no distance far enough to break that connection. The tower has been in my dreams since that first sighting, and now it's in my waking thoughts too, a constant weight at the back of my mind. I feel them waiting, patient as stone, knowing what I haven't quite admitted to myself yet. I'm still on the ranch, still here, months after I told myself I'd leave. The other hands don't meet my eyes anymore. Pete watches me with something like pity. And every few days, I drive past the tower, slowing as I approach, looking for those figures. Sometimes I see them. Sometimes I don't. But I always stop. Always sit there in the idling truck, feeling that pull, that invitation. The daughter waves, slow and patient, and each time it gets a little harder to drive away. Each time the gap between us feels a little smaller. I tell myself I'm still fighting it, still resisting. But late at night, when I can't sleep, I wonder if that's true. Wonder if maybe I'm just taking my time, saying my goodbyes, preparing for the inevitable moment when I'll walk across that yellowed grass and take my place in the line. When I'll finally understand what they've been trying to show me all along. The tower stands in the eastern pasture, visible from nearly everywhere on the ranch. I see it constantly now, a marker, a monument, a promise. And beneath it, three figures wait with infinite patience, knowing that eventually, one way or another, I'll join them. All I have to do is stop fighting, stop running, stop pretending that I was ever anything but theirs from that first moment I saw them standing motionless in the August heat. It's just a matter of time now. And out here, beneath that vast sky, with that tower rising like a skeletal finger from the earth, time feels like something that doesn't quite work the way it should. Like something that might bend, or loop, or trap you in a moment that never ends. I should be terrified. And I am. But there's something else too. something that feels almost like relief. Like the exhaustion of fighting is finally giving way to acceptance. Like soon, very soon, I'll understand why they stand there, watching that highway. What they're waiting for. What I've been becoming since the day I first saw them. The tower waits. They wait. And increasingly, I find myself waiting too, though I couldn't tell you what for. Just that when it comes, when that final moment arrives, I'll recognize it. I'll walk across that distance without hesitation, take my place in the line, and finally rest. Or maybe I already have. And this, all of this, is just the echo of a man who doesn't know he's already standing in that yellowed grass, translucent in the morning light, waving slowly at the next person who'll drive past and slow their truck and stare across the distance at something that shouldn't be seen. Maybe we're all waiting together now, beneath the tower, while the world moves past on the highway and the seasons change and the living convince themselves we're just heat shimmer, just stories, just old ghosts that don't mean anything at all. Story 9. The photographs hadn't prepared me for the dolls. I'd scrolled through the Airbnb listing a dozen times before booking. The Victorian mansion looked perfect for the writing retreat I desperately needed. High ceilings, ornate woodwork, that romantic decay that made for excellent atmosphere. The host's description mentioned period-appropriate decor and authentic Victorian furnishings, which I'd interpreted as maybe some uncomfortable chairs and faded wallpaper. What I encountered when I pushed through the heavy oak door that October evening was something else entirely. They were everywhere. Porcelain faces stared from every surface, perched on mantels, arranged on side tables, nestled into corners of overstuffed velvet chairs. China dolls with those unsettling glass eyes that seemed to follow movement. Bisque dolls with delicate painted features and real human hair. Composition dolls from the turn of the century, their surfaces crazed with age. The sitting room alone held at least 30 of them, their tiny hands frozen in various gestures, their rosebud mouths caught between smiles and something more ambiguous. I stood in the doorway with my duffel bag, staring at the assembled collection, and felt the first whisper of unease curl through my stomach. The listing had mentioned nothing about dolls. Nothing at all. The house smelled of old wood and lavender sachet, with an undercurrent of something I couldn't identify. Not quite mildew, not quite dust. Something organic and faintly sweet. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved deeper into the space, and I noticed how the sound seemed to echo, as if the house were much larger than its 3 stories suggested. I told myself it was quirky, eccentric, the kind of detail that would make a good story later, something to share over drinks with friends who'd laugh at my discomfort. After all, I'd driven 4 hours to get here, and the place had been non-refundable. Besides, I needed this. Needed the isolation. Needed the break from the apartment where every corner reminded me of the manuscript I couldn't finish. The deadline I'd already missed twice. The increasingly terse emails from my editor. The bedroom was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a hallway lined with more dolls arranged on narrow shelves. The wallpaper was a deep burgundy with a pattern of climbing vines that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. My room held a 4-poster bed with heavy brocade curtains, a writing desk positioned by the window, and, of course, more dolls. These were larger, the kind meant to sit in corners or on beds as decoration. One occupied a small rocking chair near the fireplace, dressed in a white nightgown with lace at the collar. Another sat propped against the pillows, its painted eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. I moved them both to the closet, shutting the door firmly. The room felt marginally better without their presence, though I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The windows faced the back garden, where twilight was settling between the overgrown shrubs and skeletal trees. No neighboring houses visible. No lights except the ones I'd turned on inside. Perfect isolation. That's what I'd wanted. That first night I tried to write. Sat at the desk with my laptop, the cursor blinking accusingly on the blank page. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a sound like whispered conversation. The house made noises, the settling of old timber, the pop and groan of aging joints that I told myself were perfectly normal. Every structure had its vocabulary of sounds, but there were other noises too, soft ones, a faint creaking that might have been floorboards expanding, a barely audible rustling that could have been mice in the walls, and once, around 11 o'clock, what sounded distinctly like footsteps on the stairs, slow and measured, before stopping at what I judged to be the landing. I waited, listening, my fingers frozen over the keyboard. The steps didn't resume. After 5 minutes of straining silence, I convinced myself it had been the house settling, or perhaps my own heartbeat pounding in my ears loud enough to manifest as external sound. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it came, it was shallow and fraught with half-dreams, where the dolls' positions had changed, where their painted eyes had gained depth and awareness. I woke to absolute darkness and the certainty that something had changed. The room felt different, the air thicker, pressing against my skin with an almost tangible weight. I lay perfectly still, listening to the silence that wasn't quite silent. There was a quality to it, a held breath expectancy that made the hair on my arms stand up. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:00 a.m., its red numbers the only source of light. Then I heard it. A voice, small and clear, with the precise enunciation of someone very young, though the timbre carried an odd flatness that made my stomach clench. "I can give you your heart's desire." The words came from somewhere near the foot of the bed, and they seemed to hang in the air, reverberating with a quality that suggested they'd been spoken directly into my ear despite the distance. I didn't move. Couldn't move. My body had gone rigid, every muscle locked in that primal freeze response that predates rational thought. My eyes strained against the darkness, trying to discern shapes, but the room was too black. The window that had shown the garden earlier was now just a rectangle of slightly lesser darkness. "I know what you want," the voice continued, and there was something wrong with the rhythm of it, the way the words connected, too smooth, too measured, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. "I can help you." My hand crept toward the nightstand, fingers searching for my phone. The movement felt enormously loud in the silence, and part of me was terrified that whatever was speaking would notice, would react. My fingers found the phone's edge, closed around it. "Don't," the voice said, and now it was closer, right beside the bed. "You don't need that. You need to listen." I turned on the phone's flashlight, swinging it toward the voice's origin. Nothing. Just the empty space beside the bed, the flowered carpet undisturbed. The rocking chair in the corner sat motionless. I swept the light around the room, the desk, the fireplace, the closet door still firmly shut. Everything as I'd left it. My breathing came harsh and fast. I checked behind me under the bed. Nothing. The room was empty except for me and the furniture and the suffocating presence of something I couldn't see or explain. I kept the phone light on, propped against a pillow, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As dawn crept gray and reluctant through the window, I told myself I'd been dreaming. A hypnagogic hallucination, that strange state between sleeping and waking where the brain produces vivid sensory experiences. It happened to people all the time. Stress, isolation, an unfamiliar environment, all perfect conditions for the mind to play tricks. The rational explanation felt thin even as I constructed it. Morning light made the house less oppressive but no less strange. I discovered more dolls as I explored. A china cabinet in the dining room held dozens of miniatures, their faces pressed against the glass. The bathroom had 3 perched on a shelf above the tub, their eyes angled downward as if watching whoever bathed. I found myself avoiding looking at them directly, as if acknowledging their presence too fully might somehow activate something I wanted to remain dormant. I tried to work. Opened my laptop, stared at the manuscript I'd been wrestling with for 6 months. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself listening to the house, cataloging its sounds. A pipe knocking somewhere deep in the walls. The creak of the porch boards as temperature changed. That persistent rustling that might have been wind, but might have been something else. Around 2 in the afternoon, I decided I needed air, needed to put distance between myself and the watching faces. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, but something made me pause in the entryway. The sitting room was visible from where I stood, and the arrangement of dolls on the mantel looked different. I was almost certain there had been 5 of them that morning, 2 larger ones flanking 3 smaller ones. Now there were 6, and their positions had shifted. The largest doll, a Victorian lady in a burgundy dress, now faced the room rather than the wall. I stood staring for a long moment, trying to remember if I was wrong about the original arrangement. Maybe I'd miscounted. Maybe I hadn't been paying attention. The alternative, that someone had entered while I was upstairs, or that the dolls themselves had moved, was not something I wanted to consider. Outside, the October air was sharp and clean, cutting through the heaviness that seemed to cling to the house's interior. I walked the perimeter of the property, noting the overgrown garden, the iron fence marking the boundaries, the distance to the nearest neighbor, at least half a mile through thick woods. The isolation was total. If something happened here, if I needed help, how long would it take anyone to reach me? Why was I thinking about needing help? I circled back to the front of the house and looked up at the windows. 3rd floor, 2nd floor, 1st floor, all those panes of glass reflecting the overcast sky. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement in one of the upper windows, a pale shape drawing back from the glass. But when I focused on it, there was nothing, just the reflection of clouds and skeletal branches. I went back inside because there was nowhere else to go. The afternoon stretched into evening. I forced myself to eat something from the groceries I'd brought, though my appetite had vanished. The kitchen was marginally better than the other rooms. Fewer dolls, more utilitarian spaces. But even here I found 2 sitting on a shelf above the stove, their faces shadowed in the waning light. Night fell early, the way it does in October. By 6 o'clock, darkness pressed against the windows, and I was acutely aware of being alone in this massive house, with its strange decorations and its vocabulary of unsettling sounds. I thought about leaving, just packing up and driving back to the city, but pride stopped me. And something else, a stubborn refusal to admit I was frightened. Frightened of what? Dolls? The dark? My own imagination? But when I thought about getting in my car, about driving away, relief flooded through me so powerfully it was almost physical. I compromised. Went to my car and retrieved the knife I kept in the glove compartment, a folding utility knife with a 3-inch blade. It was something, at least. A small piece of agency in a situation that felt increasingly outside my control. Back in the bedroom, I tried to read, but couldn't focus on the words. The silence felt expectant again, that same quality it had held the previous night. I checked the closet where I'd stored the dolls. They were still there, positioned exactly as I'd left them. The rocking chair sat empty. Everything appeared normal. I got into bed at 11, knowing I wouldn't sleep. The knife was on the nightstand, closed but accessible. I'd positioned my phone beside it, fully charged. The lamp stayed on, casting the room in warm yellow light that somehow made the shadows in the corners seem deeper by contrast. 3 a.m. approached with the inexorable quality of something fated. At 2:47, I felt the change. The air grew heavier, pressing down with that same tangible weight. My skin prickled with awareness of something shifting in the house, some presence stirring. I sat up in bed, hand moving to the knife, and waited. The voice, when it came, sounded like it was coming from inside the walls themselves, emanating from multiple points simultaneously. You didn't answer me. About your heart's desire. My fingers closed around the knife, opened it. The small blade caught the lamplight. Having it in my hand made me feel marginally less helpless, though helpless against what I couldn't have articulated. I know what you need, the voice continued, and now it was closer, somewhere in the room, though I could see no source. The words won't come because you're afraid. Afraid of what you'll discover about yourself if you write the truth. I can take that fear away. I can give you what you've been missing. The words struck something deep and uncomfortable. The manuscript I couldn't finish dealt with themes I'd been dancing around. truths about my own past I hadn't wanted to confront directly. My editor had called the draft emotionally evasive. She wasn't wrong. "What are you?" I managed to say, my voice rough with adrenaline. "What do you think I am?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. What did I think it was? A hallucination born from stress and isolation? Some preserved recording triggered by the house's systems? An actual presence? Something that existed independent of my perception? "I think," I said slowly, "that I'm very tired and stressed and probably experiencing some kind of psychological break." Silence. Then, something that might have been laughter, a sound like wind chimes or breaking glass, high and crystalline and profoundly wrong. "Do you? Is that really what you think?" Movement in my peripheral vision. I turned sharply toward it, knife held out like a talisman. The rocking chair was moving, not violently, but in slow, measured arcs, as if someone had just stood from it. Back and forth, back and forth. The sound it made was like bone scraping bone. "Put the knife away," the voice said, and now it carried an edge I hadn't heard before. Not quite anger, but something colder. "You don't need protection from me. I'm trying to help you." "I don't want your help." "Yes, you do. Everyone wants what I offer. The thing they've been missing. The piece that makes them whole. You've been incomplete for so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to be entire." The rocking chair continued its motion, and I couldn't look away from it. The knife felt suddenly ridiculous in my hand. What was I going to do with it? Stab a voice? Fight a moving chair? "Tell me what you want," the voice pressed. "Say it out loud. Give it form. That's the first step." And the terrible thing was, I wanted to speak the truth I'd been avoiding, that I was terrified I'd lost whatever talent I'd once had, that the well had run dry, that everything I wrote now felt hollow and derivative, that I was approaching 40 with nothing to show for the last decade but a handful of moderately successful stories, and a growing certainty that I'd peaked early and was now in decline. The words gathered in my throat, pushing to be released. "No." I stood from the bed, knife still in hand, and moved toward the door. "I'm leaving." "You won't." "Watch me." I pulled the door open, stepped into the hallway. The darkness here was absolute, the light from my room penetrating only a few feet. I could see the shapes of the dolls on their shelves, their faces turned toward me. Or maybe that was my imagination. Maybe they'd always been facing this direction. "You can't leave," the voice said. And now it was all around me, coming from the walls themselves. "You haven't finished what you came here to do. You haven't faced what needs facing." I moved toward the stairs, hand trailing along the wall for guidance. My eyes were adjusting, finding the faint illumination that came from somewhere. Maybe the windows, maybe some reflected light from outside. The house groaned around me, settling, or perhaps reacting to my presence. Every step felt like it took enormous courage, my body screaming at me to go back to the relative safety of the lit room. At the top of the stairs, I paused. The darkness below was complete. Going down would mean descending into that blackness, and every instinct I possessed was telling me not to. Something waited there, something that wanted me to come to it. "Your heart's desire," the voice whispered, intimate as a lover. "All you have to do is ask." I thought about my car just outside, about the drive back to the city, to my empty apartment and my failed manuscript, and my disappointed editor, about returning to that half-life I'd been living, that slow drowning in inadequacy and fear. What was waiting for me there? More of the same, more of nothing. "What do you actually want from me?" I asked the darkness. The silence that followed felt weighted with consideration. "Only what everyone wants to give me eventually. Permission." The word settled over me like a shroud. Permission for what? To help me, as it claimed? Or something else entirely? Some opening through which it could enter more fully, take root more deeply? I started down the stairs, moving carefully in the darkness. The knife was still in my hand, though I'd forgotten I was holding it. Each step down felt like a small surrender, a giving way to something I couldn't name or understand. Halfway down, I stopped. What was I doing? Where was I even going? To my car, yes, but why? To leave? To get something? The thought felt slippery, hard to hold on to. My mind felt hazy, as if I was watching myself from outside my body. "That's right," the voice encouraged, soft and pleased. "Just a little further." No, something was wrong. This wasn't me deciding to go downstairs. This was something else, something external pushing me toward an action I didn't actually want to take. I gripped the knife harder, using the small pain of the handle pressing into my palm to anchor myself in reality. "Get out of my head," I said, and my voice sounded stronger than I felt. I turned around, started back up the stairs. Each step away felt like moving through water, like I was pushing against some invisible current trying to pull me back down. The voice didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, its disappointment or anger or whatever emotion guided it. In the upstairs hallway I ran, just bolted for my room, slamming the door behind me and turning the old-fashioned key in the lock. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries. I pressed my back against the door, breathing hard, waiting for something to try to force its way in. Nothing came. The silence was total. I stayed there until my legs cramped, then moved to the bed. The lamp was still on, the room unchanged. The rocking chair had stopped moving. Everything appeared exactly as it had before I'd left. But I knew, with a certainty that bypassed rational thought, that something had tried to make me do something I didn't want to do, had tried to pull me down into the darkness of the first floor, toward some purpose I couldn't fathom. The knife was still in my hand. I looked at it, at the small blade reflecting lamplight, and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that I had it, shame that I needed it, confusion about what, exactly, I thought it would protect me from. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for dawn. The voice didn't return. 3 a.m. passed, then 4, then 5. The house settled into its normal vocabulary of sounds, creaks and groans and the whisper of wind against old glass. When gray light finally began to seep through the windows, I felt a profound exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. Every part of me ached. I couldn't stay here. That much was clear. But leaving felt complicated in ways I couldn't articulate. The voice had said I hadn't finished what I came to do, and some part of me, some stubborn, self-destructive part, wanted to know what that meant, wanted to understand what it was offering and why. Your heart's desire. Permission. What did those phrases actually mean? Morning brought no clarity, only the hard light of October sun on old wood and glass eyes. I packed mechanically, shoving clothes into my duffel without folding them. My laptop I packed last, closing it without saving any work. There was nothing to save. I hadn't written a single word. In the hallway, I paused at the top of the stairs. Daylight made everything less ominous but no less strange. The dolls watched from their shelves, their faces placid and unreadable. I thought about the arrangement in the sitting room that had changed, about the rocking chair that had moved on its own. Or had it? In the clear light of day, with the adrenaline fading, doubt crept in. Maybe I'd been half asleep. Maybe the chair had been moving all along, disturbed by some draft I hadn't noticed. Maybe the voice had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation and the suggestion of all those watching faces. Maybe. I descended the stairs carefully, duffel in one hand, the other trailing along the banister. The first floor was quiet, dust motes drifting through shafts of sunlight from the tall windows. The sitting room was visible from the base of the stairs, and I forced myself to look at it, to catalog what I saw. The dolls on the mantel had changed again. I was certain of it now. There were 7 of them, arranged in a semicircle facing the room. The Victorian lady in the burgundy dress was in the center, and the others flanked her in a formation that felt deliberate, purposeful, staged. I walked to the mantel and picked up the lady doll. Her face was porcelain, smooth and cold, with those unsettling glass eyes that seemed to hold depth despite being flat. The dress was real fabric, hand-stitched, with tiny buttons running up the back. She was heavier than I expected, and turning her over revealed a stamp on her lower back. Jumeau, 1890. An antique then, valuable. The whole collection was probably worth thousands, maybe more. Who would leave such things in an Airbnb, unguarded and unprotected, unless protection wasn't necessary, unless the dolls themselves provided it? I set the lady doll back on the mantel, but not in her original position. Instead, I placed her facing the wall, her back to the room, a small act of defiance, a way of asserting agency over a situation that had made me feel powerless. The front door was just across the entryway. My car waited beyond it. All I had to do was walk out, get in, drive away, leave this place and its strangeness behind, chalk it up to a bad experience and poor research, write a scathing review warning future guests about the undisclosed doll collection and strange atmosphere. But I hesitated. Standing there in the entrance hall, one hand on the doorknob, I felt the weight of leaving. Not regret, exactly, but a sense of something unfinished. The manuscript I couldn't write, the fear I couldn't face, the voice promising my heart's desire if I'd just give permission. What if it was real? What if there really was something here that could unlock what I'd been missing, could break through whatever block had strangled my creativity for months? What if giving up now meant giving up on more than just this weekend? No, I said aloud, to myself and to the house and to whatever presence haunted it. That's not how this works. I pulled the door open and stepped outside. The October air hit me like a baptism, clean and sharp. I loaded my duffel into the car, got into the driver's seat, and sat there for a long moment with my hands on the steering wheel. The house looked benign in daylight, just an old Victorian, slightly run down, overgrown garden needing attention. Nothing supernatural about it, nothing impossible. I looked at the knife sitting in the cup holder where I'd placed it. Such a small thing to have felt so necessary. I folded it closed and returned it to the glove compartment, where it lived between uses. Just a tool, nothing more. The drive back to the city was uneventful. I listened to the radio, stopped for gas, merged and changed lanes like a normal person doing normal things. The further I got from the house, the more dreamlike the experience became. Had it really happened? The voice, the moving chair, the sense of being pulled towards something I couldn't name. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing had been stress-induced delusion. Almost. That night, in my own bed, in my own space, I tried to sleep. The darkness felt different here, familiar, safe. No watching dolls, no sense of presence. Just ordinary urban silence punctuated by distant sirens and traffic. At 3:00 a.m., I woke to my phone buzzing with a notification. An email from the Airbnb host. Subject line, "You forgot something." I opened it with trembling fingers. "Dear guest, I noticed you departed earlier than planned. I hope everything was satisfactory with your stay. You left something behind, a knife, found on the nightstand in the bedroom. I'll hold it for you if you'd like to return for it. Otherwise, I can mail it to the address on file. Also, I wanted to mention that the doll on the sitting room mantel was moved. The Victorian lady now faces the wall. She's been positioned facing outward since 1923, when my great-grandmother arranged the collection. I've corrected it, of course, but I'm curious why you moved her. Best regards." I stared at the email, reading it 3 times. The knife was on my nightstand right now. I could see it from where I sat in bed. I'd brought it home. I distinctly remembered putting it in the glove compartment, then carrying it upstairs when I arrived home, along with my duffel and laptop. Didn't I? I got up, walked to the glove compartment. The knife was there, where it always lived. Both knives were there. I returned to the bedroom and picked up the knife from my nightstand. It was identical to the one in my car. Same model, same wear pattern on the handle, same small nick in the blade where I'd once used it to pry something open. Not similar. Identical. My hands were shaking again. I opened my laptop and pulled up the Airbnb listing, scrolling through the photos, looking for something I'd missed. There, in one of the sitting room pictures, barely visible in the background, the dolls on the mantel, 5 of them. The Victorian lady faced the room, center position, just as they'd been arranged when I arrived. Just as they'd been arranged, according to the host, since 1923. I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of my room, holding a knife that shouldn't exist, trying to construct an explanation that made sense. Bought 2 of the same model and forgot, somehow mixed them up. A coincidence combined with suggestion and unreliable memory. But I knew the way you know things in your bones, beyond rational explanation. Something had happened in that house. Something had been offered, and whether I'd accepted or not, whether I'd given permission or withheld it, a piece of that place had followed me home. The manuscript file was still open on my laptop. I looked at the blank page, the cursor blinking its accusation, and for the first time in months, I knew what I wanted to write. The words were there, waiting, the whole story laid out clear and certain in my mind. All I had to do was begin. I looked at the knife in my hand, then set it carefully on the nightstand. Both of them now. One from my car, one from somewhere else. Insurance, maybe, or evidence, or a reminder that some doors, once opened, never fully close. The cursor blinked. I began to type. My heart's desire, after all. Story 10. The memory surfaces without warning, the way they always do. Unwanted, uninvited, carrying with it the metallic taste of childhood fear. I'm standing in the upstairs hallway of my parents' old house, 7 years old, pajamas damp with sweat despite the October chill. The hall stretches before me, longer than it should be, darker than any darkness has a right to be. And there, at the far end where the hallway bends toward the guest room, stands a figure bathed in crimson light, not red clothing, not a red lamp casting its glow. The figure itself emanates redness, as if its very substance has been stained by something fundamental and wrong. It doesn't move, doesn't breathe, just stands there, human-shaped but somehow not quite human, watching me with attention I can feel pressing against my skin like static electricity. I blinked, and it was gone. That was 30 years ago. I haven't thought about it, really thought about it, in decades. The memory got filed away with other childhood peculiarities. The monster under the bed, the face in the window that was just tree branches, the sounds in the walls that were just the house settling. We all have these moments, don't we? Brief flashes of inexplicable terror that get smoothed over by time and reason until they become nothing more than amusing anecdotes about how imaginative we were as children. But lately, the memory has been returning with uncomfortable frequency. It started 3 months ago, when I moved back to my hometown, taking the job at the university I'd sworn I'd never return to. The apartment I found was in the old downtown, in one of those renovated buildings that tries too hard to maintain its historical character. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, and long hallways that seem to stretch into shadow, no matter how many lights I turn on. The first time I noticed the resemblance, I was coming home late from the library, fumbling with my keys in the dimly lit corridor outside my door. The hallway extended into darkness to my left, and for just a moment, less than a heartbeat, I felt 7 years old again. My hands went cold. My breath caught. The keys slipped from my fingers and clattered against the hardwood with a sound like breaking teeth. I told myself it was just the stress of the move, the adjustment to being back in a place I'd deliberately left behind. The mind plays tricks when we're tired, when we're displaced, when we're confronting the geography of our past. I picked up the keys, unlocked the door, and poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey I didn't particularly want but felt necessary. That night, I dreamed of the hallway. Not my apartment hallway, but the one from my childhood home. In the dream, I was both 7 and 37 simultaneously, experiencing the moment with the crystalline clarity of adult consciousness while trapped in the helpless body of a child. The figure stood at the end of the hall, red and wrong and perfectly still. I tried to move, to run, to call out, but my body refused all commands. And then, slowly, Incrementally, the figure began to raise one arm. I woke up with my own arm extended toward my bedroom door, fingers reaching for something I couldn't name. The next few weeks passed in what felt like normal routine. I taught my classes, graded papers, attended faculty meetings where people argued about parking spaces and departmental budgets with the passion of crusaders. I made small talk with my neighbors, a retired postal worker who spoke primarily about the weather, and a graduate student who kept irregular hours and always looked vaguely guilty when we crossed paths in the hallway. I bought groceries, paid bills, and established the rhythms of a life that looked, from the outside, like any other. But the hallway kept bothering me. It wasn't anything I could point to specifically. The dimensions hadn't changed. The lighting remained as inadequate as it had been the day I moved in. Yet something about it felt increasingly wrong, like a word you say over and over until it loses all meaning and becomes just sound. I started taking the stairs at the other end of the building, adding 5 minutes to my journey home just to avoid that particular stretch of corridor. The dreams continued. Not every night, but often enough that I began to dread sleep. Always the same hallway, always the same figure, always that terrible moment when it began to move. Sometimes I would wake to find myself standing in my own hallway, having walked there in my sleep, staring into the darkness toward the stairwell. Once I woke up with my palm pressed flat against my apartment door, as if I'd been about to leave, or as if I'd been trying to keep something from coming in. I started researching sleep disorders, convinced this was nothing more than stress-induced parasomnia. The internet offered a comfortable catalog of explanations: sleep deprivation, anxiety, unresolved trauma, nutritional deficiencies. I bought blackout curtains, stopped drinking coffee after 2 p.m., started taking melatonin. The sleepwalking episodes decreased, but the dreams intensified, becoming more vivid, more detailed. I could feel the texture of the carpet beneath my 7-year-old feet, smell the particular combination of dust and furniture polish that had characterized my childhood home, hear the ambient sounds of a house at night, pipes groaning, refrigerator humming, the wind finding gaps in the window frames, and I could feel the attention of the red figure like weight, like pressure, like something pushing against the inside of my skull. 2 months after moving back, I made the mistake of visiting my parents' old house. I told myself it was academic curiosity. The house had been converted into a bed and breakfast, and I thought perhaps seeing it as it was now would help dispel the hold it seemed to have on my subconscious. The new owners had renovated extensively. The wallpaper I remembered had been stripped away, replaced with neutral beige paint. The carpets had been torn up, revealing the original hardwood beneath. Even the hallway, that hallway, had been shortened by the addition of a bathroom, its proportions completely altered. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt mounting unease as the owner, a cheerful woman who spoke enthusiastically about crown molding and period-appropriate light fixtures, showed me around. Everything was different, yet something remained fundamentally the same. When we reached the upstairs hallway, now barely 10 feet long and brightly lit with Edison bulbs, I felt my pulse accelerate. The owner was talking about occupancy rates and online reviews, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" she asked, her cheerfulness faltering. "You look pale." I assured her I was fine, just a bit of nostalgia, nothing serious. But as I stood there in that bright, altered space, I could feel it, that sensation of being watched, of attention pressing against me from somewhere that existed outside the physical dimensions of the hallway. The owner was still talking, but I couldn't hear her anymore over the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. That night, the dream changed. Instead of the hallway from my childhood, I was in my apartment corridor. The figure stood at the far end, by the stairwell, bathed in that inexplicable red luminescence. But this time, when it raised its arm, I saw what it was pointing at: my apartment door. And this time, when I woke, I wasn't in my bedroom or even in my hallway. I was standing outside my building, barefoot on the cold sidewalk, still in my sleep clothes, keys somehow clutched in my hand. I started sleeping with my keys hidden in the freezer. The rational part of my mind insisted on explanations: stress, exhaustion. a manifestation of anxiety about returning to my hometown, about confronting the past, about the career choices that had led me back to a place I'd spent 2 decades avoiding. I made an appointment with a doctor who ordered blood tests and suggested therapy. Everything came back normal. The therapist I saw was kind and professional, and she spoke about trauma imprinting and how the brain sometimes processes stress through symbolic imagery. She prescribed medication that made me feel disconnected from my own thoughts, so I stopped taking it after a week. Because the thing was, the figure didn't feel like a symbol. It felt like a presence. I started noticing things, small things, insignificant things that nonetheless accumulated into a weight I carried everywhere. The hallway lights would burn out more quickly than they should, even after the building manager replaced them with new bulbs. Sometimes when I approached my door late at night, I would catch a faint scent I couldn't identify, not unpleasant exactly, but wrong, like air that has been breathed too many times. My neighbors began avoiding me, though I couldn't say exactly when this started or why. The graduate student would see me coming and suddenly remember something she needed from her car. The retired postal worker stopped talking about the weather. Was I behaving strangely? I couldn't tell anymore. I found myself standing in my hallway at odd hours, staring toward the stairwell, trying to catch sight of something I knew wasn't there but felt certain was watching. I started taking photographs of the hallway at different times of day, comparing them for changes I couldn't articulate but felt certain existed. The pictures showed nothing unusual, just an old hallway with inadequate lighting. Yet I found myself studying them for hours, zooming in on shadows, analyzing the quality of darkness. My teaching began to suffer. I would lose my train of thought mid-lecture, distracted by the sudden certainty that something was standing just outside the classroom door. Students started requesting transfers to other sections. The department chair called me in for a concerned chat about performance and wellness resources. I assured her everything was fine, even as I felt the walls of her office pressing inward, even as I noticed how her shadow seemed to extend just a bit too far across her desk. I stopped sleeping for more than an hour or two at a time. The dreams had become unbearable, not because of their content, which remained essentially unchanged, but because of how real they felt. More real, in fact, than my waking life, which had taken on a hazy, uncertain quality. Sometimes I would wake up, or think I was waking up, and find myself already standing in the hallway, facing the darkness, unable to remember getting out of bed. Other times, I would realize hours had passed without my awareness, gaps in time I couldn't account for, finding myself in different rooms with no memory of moving. The figure appeared more frequently now, not just in dreams. I would see it in my peripheral vision, a flash of red at the end of the hallway, gone when I turned to look directly. Or I would sense its presence in the apartment, a weight in the air, a feeling of space being occupied by something that didn't cast a shadow. Once, I came home to find all my cabinet doors open, though I was certain I'd closed them that morning. Another time, every picture frame in my apartment had been turned to face the wall. Or had I done these things myself? I couldn't trust my memory anymore. The line between sleep and waking had become porous, unreliable. I would remember conversations I apparently never had, lectures I never taught, trips to the store that left no evidence of groceries. The building manager knocked on my door one morning to ask about noise complaints from my neighbors. Apparently, I'd been pacing the hallway at 3 a.m., talking to myself. I had no memory of this, but I apologized anyway, promised it wouldn't happen again. Last week I found the photograph. I discovered it while going through some boxes I still hadn't unpacked from the move, tucked inside an old album I didn't remember owning. The picture showed the upstairs hallway of my childhood home, taken from the exact position I'd been standing when I saw the figure. The photograph was dated October 1995, the year it happened, and there, at the far end of the hallway where the corridor bent toward the guest room, was a smudge of red. Not a reflection, not a developing error, but a distinct form, human-shaped and wrong. I stared at that photograph for hours. Had someone else seen it too? Had someone taken a picture of it? Or had I somehow documented my own delusion? But the question that really terrified me was simpler. If someone had taken this photograph, why was I in the frame? I could see my 7-year-old self, small and pale in footed pajamas, turned away from the camera, staring down the hallway, which meant someone had been standing behind me. Someone had been there, watching me watch the figure. I don't know what's real anymore. I stand in my apartment hallway now, at 3:15 in the morning, staring toward the stairwell where the shadows pool deeper than shadows should. My neighbors' doors remain closed, though I can sense them listening, waiting, holding their breath. The building is silent in a way that feels deliberate, as if it's trying very hard not to be noticed. The hallway is longer than it was when I moved in. I'm certain of this, though I have no proof. The door to my apartment seems farther away each time I look back at it. The lights flicker, then steady, then flicker again. And at the far end of the corridor, where the hallway bends toward the stairwell, I can see it. A figure bathed in red light, human-shaped but somehow not quite human, perfectly still. It's been standing there for 3 minutes now. I've been counting, and for the first time in 30 years, I watch as it slowly begins to raise one arm, pointing at me, pointing at my door, pointing at something I'm only now beginning to understand. I'm 7 years old again, trapped in a moment that never really ended, standing in a hallway that exists somewhere between memory and presence, watching something that has been watching me for far longer than I've been watching it. The figure takes a step forward. I don't remember if I did this as a child, but I find myself taking a step toward it now, drawn by curiosity or recognition, or something that feels like inevitability. My bare feet are silent on the hardwood. My breathing is shallow. The distance between us decreases, though I can't tell which of us is moving. Behind me, I hear my apartment door slowly swing open, though I'm certain I locked it. Ahead of me, the figure remains motionless despite its impossible approach, and I realize, with a clarity that feels like drowning, that I've been asking the wrong questions all along. The question isn't whether the figure is real. The question is, have I ever actually woken up from that night 30 years ago? Have I ever actually stopped standing in that hallway, trapped in the moment between seeing and being seen? The red light grows brighter. The figure raises its other arm. And somewhere, in a hallway I can no longer locate in space or time, a 7-year-old boy continues to stand frozen, staring at something he should have run from, unable to look away from a moment that never ends. I take another step forward. The figure waits. Behind me, my apartment door closes with a soft click that sounds like finality. And I remember finally what I'd forgotten. The figure had been pointing all along. Pointing not at where I was, but at where I would be. Pointing through 30 years, through moves and careers and carefully constructed distance. Pointing at this hallway, this moment, this inevitable convergence. The red light fills my vision now, warm and wrong and somehow welcoming. And as the figure extends its hand toward me, or as I extend my hand toward it, I can no longer tell which. I understand that some hallways don't lead anywhere. They just go on forever, populated by children who looked when they shouldn't have, and the things that waited patiently for them to come back. The last thought I have, before the red light swallows everything, is that I should have asked my parents about that night. I should have asked why they moved shortly after. I should have asked what they saw in that photograph they never showed me, the one they burned in the backyard while I was at school. I should have asked why they always looked so relieved when I left for college, and so afraid when I said I was moving back. But it's too late for questions now. The hallway stretches on forever in both directions, and I'm standing in the center of it, bathed in red light, finally understanding what it means to be seen. Really seen. By something that has been waiting in the darkness of every hallway I've ever walked, patient and persistent and absolutely inevitable. Somewhere, a child is waking up, walking to the bathroom, pausing at the threshold of a dark corridor, and at the far end, they see a figure bathed in red light, human-shaped but somehow not quite human, perfectly still. The figure raises one arm, points, waits, and the cycle continues. As it always has, as it always will, in the endless hallway where everything that was seen eventually becomes what sees, where every observer eventually becomes the observed, where the red light never fades and the figure never leaves and the moment never, ever ends. Story 11. The first time I saw it, I thought someone had touched the wall with dirty hands. Maybe oil or grease from the kitchen. A perfect handprint, fingers splayed wide, pressed against the cream-colored paint in the upstairs hallway of my father's house. Adult-sized, but smaller than mine. The kind of mark you'd leave if you were steadying yourself, catching your balance in the dark. I scrubbed it away with a wet cloth that afternoon, the day after I'd moved back in to help Dad with his recovery. Hip surgery at 73 isn't nothing, and the old man needed someone around for a few weeks. The print came off easily enough, leaving only a faint shadow that disappeared once the wall dried. It was back the next morning. Same spot, same size, same position, fingers reaching upward as if grasping for something just out of reach. The light from the bathroom window hit it at an angle that made it look almost three-dimensional, like the hand was still there, frozen mid-press into the drywall. I mentioned it to Dad over breakfast. He sat at the kitchen table with his walker beside him, methodically working through scrambled eggs and toast. He didn't look up when I spoke, just made a small noise in the back of his throat that could have meant anything. Then he asked me to pass the salt, and I let it drop. The house had always been strange. Dad bought it 15 years ago after Mom passed, and I'd visited maybe twice a year since then. Each time I'd felt something off about the place, not threatening exactly, but watchful. The kind of house where you find yourself glancing over your shoulder for no reason, where shadows seem darker than they should be, where the silence has texture and weight. But I'd chalked it up to the age of the building, the creaking floors and settling foundation, the way old houses breathe and shift with temperature changes. Dad had never mentioned anything unusual, and he'd lived here alone for over a decade without complaint. Now, though, I was here for an extended stay, and the house seemed different, more awake. I cleaned the handprint again that second day, this time with bleach and a scrub brush, attacking it like I could erase whatever had left it through sheer force. My knuckles ached by the time I finished, but the wall was spotless. I even repainted that section, a small patch job that took an hour and left the hallway smelling of latex and chemicals. The print returned overnight. Same spot, same hand. That's when I started paying attention to the other things. The whispers came mostly in the evening, after sunset, but before full dark. Soft voices that seemed to drift through the walls themselves. Never quite clear enough to make out words, but distinct enough to know they were there. At first I thought it was the neighbor's television bleeding through the shared wall of the duplex. But when I checked, the unit next door had been empty for months. A rental property caught in some kind of legal limbo, Dad said when I asked. The footsteps were harder to dismiss. They moved through the upstairs rooms with purposeful rhythm, always when I was downstairs helping Dad with his exercises or making dinner. Slow, measured steps that paced from the bedroom to the bathroom and back again. I'd freeze mid-sentence, listening, and Dad would continue talking as if he heard nothing. Once, I excused myself and went up to investigate, taking the stairs two at a time, but the second floor was empty, still and silent. The handprint watched me from the hallway wall. I stopped mentioning these things to Dad. He had enough to worry about with his recovery. And besides, there was something in his eyes when I brought up the house. A flicker of recognition, maybe, or resignation. Like he knew exactly what I was talking about, but had decided long ago not to discuss it. Instead, I started doing my own research. Late at night after Dad was asleep, I'd sit in the living room with my laptop and search for the house's history. Property records showed it had changed hands 7 times in 30 years before Dad bought it. Not unusual for rental properties, but this place had been owner-occupied each time. People moving in, staying 2 or 3 years, then selling. No pattern I could identify, no deaths or tragedies associated with the address. Just a steady turnover of residents who apparently decided they'd rather live somewhere else. The shower incident happened on my 8th night in the house. I was alone in the bathroom, steam filling the small space, water beating against my shoulders and back. My eyes were closed, shampooing my hair when I felt it. A hand, solid and warm, pressing down on my left shoulder blade. A grip, firm but not aggressive, the way someone might touch you to get your attention. I spun around so fast I nearly fell, soap burning my eyes, hands up defensively. The shower was empty. Water continued to fall. The curtain hung undisturbed, but the sensation lingered on my skin, that specific pressure of fingers and palm, and when I looked down at my shoulder, I could see red marks beginning to form. Not a handprint exactly, but the kind of irritation that comes from being touched too hard. I got out. I dried off. I did not tell Dad. That night, I heard the whispers directly outside my bedroom door, not through walls or from distant rooms, but right there in the hallway, as clear as if someone was standing with their mouth inches from the wood. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was conversational. Multiple voices having a discussion about something that seemed important to them. I lay in bed, covers pulled to my chin, staring at the gap beneath the door where light from the hallway spilled in. Shadows moved across that band of light. Shapes that suggested feet, but not quite. Not exactly. I didn't open the door. I waited until the voices faded and the shadows stilled. Then I waited another hour. When I finally emerged in the morning, exhausted and jittery, the handprint had multiplied. There were now 3 of them, arranged in a descending diagonal along the wall. Same hand, same positioning, like something had caught itself while falling. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, already dressed, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, concern mixed with something else. Knowledge, maybe. "You should burn the incense," he said quietly. I stared at him. "What?" "Sage and copal, in the wooden box under the bathroom sink. Light it. Walk through every room. Doesn't matter if you believe it works. Just do it." He didn't elaborate, didn't explain why he had these things, or how long he'd been using them. Just went back to his coffee while I stood there processing this revelation. My father, who'd always been relentlessly practical and skeptical, who'd mocked my mother's interest in crystals and tarot cards, was telling me to sage the house. I found the box exactly where he said it would be. 2 thick bundles of dried herbs, a small bag of resin chunks, and a tarnished brass holder. Instructions written in Dad's careful handwriting on an index card. Light and carry through house. All rooms. Windows open. Every 3 days or when it gets bad. When it gets bad. The smoke was thick and acrid, nothing like the pleasant incense I'd encountered in yoga studios or New Age shops. This smelled of earth and char, and something ancient. I walked through the house with the burning bundle, feeling ridiculous and desperate in equal measure. Smoke filled the rooms, curling against ceilings, seeking corners and closets. I did the entire first floor, then climbed the stairs to tackle the second. The handprints were gone when I reached the upstairs hallway, not faded, completely gone, as if they'd never been there. The wall was smooth and unmarked. Relief flooded through me, so intense I had to lean against the banister. The smoke continued to burn in my hand, and I finished the ritual because I'd started it, moving through bedrooms and bathroom and the small office Dad used for storage. By the time I'd circled back downstairs, my eyes were watering and my throat felt raw. But the house seemed different, lighter somehow, less oppressive. The quiet lasted 2 days. On the 3rd evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard the crash from the living room. Loud and metallic, the unmistakable sound of something being thrown. I found Dad struggling to sit up from his recliner, face pale, staring at the floor near the television. One of his aluminum cans, the kind he kept in a small basket beside his chair for recycling, lay in the center of the room, at least 8 feet from where it should have been. "Did you throw that?" I asked, though I could see from his position and expression that he hadn't. He shook his head slowly. "Used to happen more often, before I started the incense routine." "How long?" My voice came out hoarse. "How long have you been dealing with this?" Dad settled back into his chair with a wince, adjusting his bad hip. "Since I moved in. Maybe started a month after. Little things at first, then bigger things. The handprint's been constant. Shows up every few days no matter what I do." "Why didn't you tell me?" Why did you stay? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the can on the floor. Where else would I go? I'm an old man with a fixed income and a house that's paid off. And besides, he trailed off, then gestured vaguely at the walls around us. It's not trying to hurt anyone. It's just here. Been here longer than me, probably. We've come to an understanding. I picked up the can and put it back in the basket, hands shaking slightly. An understanding. The incense keeps it manageable. Quiet, mostly. Some nights are worse than others. I wanted to argue, to tell him this wasn't normal or acceptable, to insist we call someone, though who that someone would be, I had no idea. Instead, I finished making dinner, and we ate in silence, broken only by the sound of silverware on plates and the occasional creak of the house settling around us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the old house, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the tick of pipes cooling, the whisper of wind against windows. But beneath those normal noises, I heard others. Soft footsteps in the hallway, the whisper of fabric brushing against walls, breathing that wasn't mine. I'd left the bedside lamp on, unable to face the darkness completely, and in its yellow glow, I could see my bedroom door clearly. The handle turned slowly, silently, moving a quarter rotation before stopping. The door didn't open, just the handle, moving as if someone was testing it, checking to see if it was locked. It wasn't locked. I never locked it. But the door stayed closed. The handle returned to its original position. Footsteps moved away, that same measured pace I'd heard before, fading down the hallway toward the stairs. I was out of bed before I could second-guess myself, grabbing my phone and activating the flashlight. The hallway was empty when I eased the door open, but I could still hear the footsteps descending the staircase. I followed, each step deliberate, heart hammering against my ribs. The first floor was dark except for the nightlight in the kitchen. I swept my phone's beam across the living room, the dining area, the hallway leading to Dad's room. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Then I saw them. Seated on the couch, perfectly still, were two figures. Not solid, not transparent, something in between. They had the suggestion of form, of human shape, but no features I could focus on, like shadows given dimension, or the after image that lingers when you close your eyes too tight. They sat upright, hands in laps, facing the television that hadn't been on for hours. They were watching, or waiting. I stood frozen, phone light trembling in my grip, unable to move forward or back. The figures didn't acknowledge me, didn't turn or react or fade. They simply sat, present and patient, as if they'd been sitting there every night since Dad moved in. Maybe they had been. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds. Time felt elastic, unreliable. Eventually I backed away, one step at a time, keeping my light trained on the figures until I reached the stairs. They never moved. When I finally turned and climbed back to the second floor, my legs felt like water. The handprint had returned to the wall, just one now, but lower than before, roughly at the height of my waist. The position was different too, fingers pointing downward, as if reaching for the floor, or reaching for help. I burned the incense again the next morning, not waiting for Dad to wake up. Took the bundle and walked through every room, filling the house with smoke while dawn light crept through the windows. The seated figures were gone from the couch. The handprint faded as I passed it, dissipating like morning fog. When Dad emerged from his room an hour later, leaning on his walker, he took one breath of the lingering smoke and nodded approval. We made breakfast together in silence, and I didn't mention what I'd seen. Maybe I didn't need to. Maybe he'd seen the same things, or worse, during his years alone in this house. "You don't have to stay," he said finally, scrambling eggs at the stove while I toasted bread. "If it's too much, I can hire a nurse." I thought about leaving, thought about packing my things and returning to my apartment in the city, letting someone else deal with whatever occupied this house alongside my father. It would be easier, saner. "I'm staying," I heard myself say, "at least until you're mobile again." Dad nodded, unsurprised. The incense helps. Stick to the schedule. Every 3 days or sooner if you notice the signs. What about when I leave? What happens then? He slid the eggs onto plates, moving carefully to protect his healing hip. Same thing that's been happening. Same thing that'll keep happening. This house has its residents. We're just the ones paying the mortgage. Over the following days, I learned the rhythms. The handprint appeared most often in the early morning, between 3 and 5 a.m. The footsteps preferred twilight. The whispers came and went without pattern. The seated figures, I saw them twice more, only manifested deep in the night, and only when I'd gone downstairs. They never appeared if I stayed in my room. The shower incident repeated once. Same pressure on my shoulder, same brief, solid touch that left no mark this time. I'd learned not to turn around, not to look. Just acknowledge the presence with a small nod and continue washing. The hand released after a moment, and the rest of my shower passed undisturbed. I burned the incense religiously. Every 3 days, sometimes every 2 if the house felt particularly active. The smoke seemed to create a buffer, a negotiated space where we could coexist with whatever else occupied these rooms. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was management, containment. Dad improved steadily. His hip healed, his mobility returned, and by the end of the month he could navigate the stairs without assistance. We developed a routine, breakfast together, his physical therapy exercises, lunch, an afternoon walk around the neighborhood, dinner, television, bed. Normal life, except for the parts that weren't normal at all. I stopped researching the house's history, stopped trying to find explanations or precedents. Some questions don't have answers you'd want to know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, because the truth might be worse than uncertainty. The night before I was scheduled to leave, I woke to find a figure standing at the foot of my bed. Small, child height, but wrong somehow. Proportions slightly off, like a reflection in disturbed water. It stood perfectly still, and though I couldn't see features in the darkness, I knew it was looking at me, studying me. We regarded each other for a long time. Minutes, hours. My heart rate had spiked initially, but gradually calmed as nothing changed, nothing threatened. The figure was simply there, present, observing. "I'm leaving tomorrow," I whispered, unsure why I felt the need to announce this. "But he's better now. He'll be okay." The figure didn't respond, didn't move. After a while, it simply faded, dispersing like smoke until only the darkness remained. I didn't sleep again that night. At breakfast, Dad was more talkative than usual, discussing plans for his continued recovery and thanking me for staying as long as I had. He seemed lighter, more animated. Relieved, maybe, that I was leaving before the house could claim me the way it had claimed him. Not through violence or malevolence, but through simple, persistent presence. The weight of being watched, the burden of coexistence. I packed my things in the afternoon. As I carried my bags downstairs, I passed the hallway wall one final time. The handprint was there, but different now. Smaller than before. Delicate, with thin fingers that seemed to reach upward with something like yearning. I stopped, stared at it, raised my own hand and pressed it against the wall beside the mark. My handprint was larger, broader, completely different in shape and size. When I lowered my hand and stepped back, both prints remained, mine and the other, side by side on the cream-colored paint. "Take care of him," I said quietly to the empty hallway, to the house, to whatever listened in the spaces between walls. I thought I heard a whisper in response. Might have been the wind. Might have been my imagination. Might have been acknowledgement. Dad walked me to the car, moving easily now, his walker left behind in the house. We hugged goodbye on the sidewalk and he squeezed my shoulder, the same shoulder something had touched in the shower. "You'll visit?" he asked. "Of course. Bring the incense when you come, the sage. I'm running low." I promised I would, got in my car, pulled away from the house with its cream-colored paint and shuttered windows and secrets that breathed in the walls. In my rearview mirror, I saw Dad standing in the driveway, watching me go. And behind him, barely visible in the afternoon sun, shadows moved across the living room window. Shapes that suggested human forms but weren't quite. Watchers. Residents. The house stood solid and ordinary-looking among its neighbors. Just another aging duplex on a tree-lined street. No different from a dozen others in the area. Unremarkable in every way except one. I drove toward the city, toward my apartment with its thin walls and noisy neighbors and complete absence of handprints, toward normalcy. But I knew I'd return. Not just to visit Dad, but because some part of me needed to know if the house would remember, if the small figure would appear again, if my handprint would still be there on the wall, pressed beside the other like a pact or a promise. Some questions demand answers even when you know the truth might shatter you. I'd be back. The house would be waiting.